Chapter 827. Plenty of people coming and going. Despite getting in bed, Klein didn't manage to sleep until daybreak. This was because he believed that, with most people stirred awake from the commotion underground, him sleeping too soundly without noticing anything would make him suspicious. Indeed, just as he got out of bed, walked to the balcony, and drew the curtains to pretend to search for the source of the commotion, Walter came knocking at his door. 2 servants with double-barreled hunting rifles were assigned to protect their employer to prevent any accidents from happening. Before long, the police arrived. Based on the descriptions of the residents in the area, they identified the sewers as the target. As for what they discovered or whether they sought backup from the Nighthawks, the ordinary citizen, Mr. Dwayne Dantes, had no idea. After confirming that there wouldn't be any more accidents, he sent his butler and servants away and quickly got some sleep. By the time he woke up again, Buckland Street had been restored to normal. Pedestrians were on the streets, and the carriages were coming and going. The intis parasol trees that lined the side of the street continued making the area seem tranquil. Are the results of the investigation out? Klein looked at himself in the mirror as he asked Richardson, who was helping him smooth his clothes. Richardson had already inquired about the matter and was waiting for his employer to ask. He immediately replied, apparently some gang members were trading firearms in the nearby sewers and accidentally triggered an explosion. What a reasonable explanation. Klein didn't probe deeper, nor did he consider where the demigod of the Marauder pathway who stole away his thoughts went to or if the Nighthawks found him. Firstly, this was because he believed that the demigod's action of igniting the explosives would definitely implicate him in a serious manner. If the demigod had the ability or suitable environment to do so, he would have long parasitized Hazel without going through the convoluted and troublesome hassle. This also meant that in the next 2 to 3 weeks, or even 2 to 3 months, Klein didn't need to worry about the demigod. Secondly, if he continued pursuing the matter and pushed the demigod into a corner, Klein had no doubts that he would be harmed as a result. Once the demigod lost all inhibitions and began affecting the surroundings on a large scale. Then, even if he didn't expose himself, he would suffer the demigod's attack, as well as implicate the innocent residents along the street. Apart from the first 2 reasons, Klein was apprehensive over the matter. If anomalies kept happening in the originally normal Buckland Street, it was bound to attract a deeper level of suspicion from the official Beyonders. And all of this happened after Dwayne Dantes moved in. Even if Klein's body was covered in mouths, there was no way he could explain himself. When the time came, he would have to give up on his plans and reconsider new ones. I shouldn't head into the sewers for the time being. There's probably a trap laid by the official Beyonders. There's one thing to do. Take note of Hazel without leaving any clues. I'll observe to see if there are any abnormalities about her, and once I discover any dangerous signs, I'll immediately turn into hero bandit and put up advertisements at St. Samuel Cathedral. Klein went downstairs to have breakfast with a composed look. After doing so, he returned to his master bedroom and got Richardson to wait by the door. As for himself, he took out the almost torn paper crane from his wallet. He planned on using it one last time and inform Snake of Fate while accepting of the choices that Admiral of Stars was offering him, and if he was agreeable or not. Typically, he could complete such matters by visiting his parents. However, without Dr. Aaron's invitation, and him lacking a sufficient reason to pay a visit, that wasn't the best choice, as it easily made others question his motives. He obviously couldn't tell Dr. Aaron that he wasn't there for him, but for the fetus in his wife's womb. After carefully unfolding the paper crane, Klein glanced at the pencil marks left on it. His intuition told him that, as long as he used an eraser, the paper would definitely tear. However, this didn't stump him. He got a black fountain pen and directly wrote on it, "The other party has made their offer." The black ink was a lot more obvious than the pencil marks, therefore, although the text overlapped, it didn't affect anyone from recognizing the words written on it. There are always more solutions than problems. Klein nodded in satisfaction as he folded the unfolded piece of paper according to its crease marks. This time, he suspected that unfolding it again would result in it tearing. In the Berg household in the City of Silver. Ever since the tarot gathering ended, Derek was like a petrified statue who sat by his bed, motionless. After an unknown period of time, he was awakened by the noise on the streets outside. However, the feeling that he was still in a nightmare continued enveloping him. It made his footsteps towards the window appear especially heavy. God might already be dead. God might not return again. Such thoughts kept resounding inside Derek's mind as he felt an irresistible sense of despair and pain. Back when he had to kill his parents with his own hands, he had already suspected if God would return or show his blessings to his forsaken people of the dark. He later thought of relying on Mr. Fool, allowing himself to become the true son and help the people of the City of Silver to escape their cursed fates. However, having been educated from a young age and the environment constantly affecting him, he still looked forward to the return of the Creator. He held expectations that sacrifices and the repentance of the City of Silver would earn them a response. And now, all his hopes had been dashed. The tiny sliver of hope that was left had now been engulfed by the darkness. The City of Silver will continue in this state until it disappears into the darkness. There will be no one remembering that we once existed and struggled. Derek cast his gaze out the window and saw many of his neighbors gathered together. They were praying and seeking forgiveness from the Lord that created everything. This wasn't a ritual organized by the 6-member council, but a tradition that took form in the City of Silver after 2,000 to 3,000 years. They would pray for almost anything: good developments, unstable emotions, an injury in the family, and the birth of new life. Lightning streaked across the sky and illuminated the streets. Derek stood motionless in the darkness of his room, staring outside in a daze. Unknowingly, he clenched his fists. By the time his neighbors dispersed, he finally retracted his gaze, his expression somewhat warped. He reached out to touch Thunder God's roar as his gaze gradually focused. He planned on following Mr. Hanged Man's advice to befriend others to help him. Soon, he felt a little stumped because he had no idea how to make friends. Nor did he know how to warmly greet others or find a topic of conversation. This was in violation of his own character. After some thought, Derek decided to head to the training field and use combat to re-establish ties with people he was familiar with in the past. That was a gathering ground for the residents of the City of Silver where he often met people he found familiar. It was late at night once again. Klein once again saw the pitch-black steeple and desolate plains in his dream as he had desired. Passing through one obstacle after another, he arrived at the region with the scattered tarot cards. A black pram was already waiting there. Will Septon, who was wrapped in silver silk, asked with a bright voice, "What are the choices? You are being very proactive this time. What happened to your reservation as a sequence one? However, kids are like that. It's good that you maintain such a state of mind." Klein silently chuckled as he said, "2 choices. Choose either one. 1, it's to take one look at the Wheel of Fortune card. 2, it's the method to regain a certain amount of strength during your weak stages." Will Septon fell silent for a second and chuckled. "So it's Bernadette on the other side. My intuition was right after all. I'll be able to obtain something good this time." Following that, he asked, "Which choice do you think I'll choose?" Klein's subconscious idea was, "I have a chance of posing a question once." Then, he said with a self-deprecating laugh, "2. Will Septon sked and said, "Do I look like a mythical creature that doesn't have such methods? I've already restarted so many times. I definitely have the right state of mind to make preparations." "Reasonable." Klein nodded and said, "You wish to take a look at the Wheel of Fortune card? Or do you want them to switch the choices?" Will Septon sucked at his thumb and said, "I choose 2. Klein's expression froze. Will Septon smiled and said, "Knowing one more method means one more trump card. Isn't that the right thing to do?" "Yes, whatever you say is right." Klein replied in exasperation, "All right. When can you complete the transaction?" Will Septon waved his short arms and said, "Of course it's when I'm born and have the placenta blood. This will probably be in early July, but it might be brought forward." Having said that, he relaxed his limbs as he chuckled. "I wouldn't mind it either if they wished to hand me the method ahead of time. They? Klein subconsciously asked, unsure how the snake of Mercury knew that it was they and not her, Queen Mystic, Bernadette. Will Septon sucked at his thumb and said indiscernibly, Bernadette has already passed that stage. The stage, that needs a drop of mythical creature blood, is likely being prepared, for her subordinate. Is that the case? Ma'am Hermit needs it? Klein asked thoughtfully, what is that drop of mythical creature blood for? The main ingredient of some potion? He connected it to the fact that a drop of divine blood from the eternal blazing sun could be used for the unshadowed potion's main ingredient. No, isn't it suicidal for other pathways to consume the blood of a fate pathway mythical creature? Will Septon said with a scoff. I heard that to advance from sequence 5 to sequence 4 for the mystery prior pathway, there's a need to completely analyze a drop of a mythical creature's blood and, from there, obtain complicated and massive amounts of knowledge. This is part of the ritual. As the mythical creature blood used is different, what they will be proficient at during the mysticologist stage will also differ. To think that's possible. The rituals of the different pathways and different sequences all have their unique traits. Klein bowed in enlightenment and said, thank you for your answer. Will Septon waved his hand and said, stop disturbing me. Letting me be born in peace is the greatest form of gratitude. Without waiting for Klein to answer, he added, giving me that method doesn't count. With that said, the black pram retreated and entered the shadows before vanishing. Klein watched the surrounding walls collapse as he silently heaved a sigh of relief. He planned on escaping to sleep again. At this moment, he froze because he discovered a new power infiltrating his dream. Another one is coming just after one left. This is more lively than in the day. As Klein changed the dream according to his wishes, he pretended to look around in a daze. Chapter 828, Movement of the Night. Klein had set the dream to be that of 160 Buckland Street. He produced many beauties that circled around Dwayne Dantes. He did this to perfectly create the image of a knowledgeable and experienced tycoon who could only let go in his dreams while holding back in the real world to uphold his reputation. Sitting on a sofa and receiving a cup of red wine from a young lady, Klein found his surroundings suddenly change before he could even taste it. It turned from his brightly lit villa filled with elegant beauties to a dark, humid, and dirty sewer. Following that, he saw 5 familiar explosives in his hands. Aren't these the ones I placed earlier? Klein was first taken aback as he pretended to jump in fright, throwing away the explosives as he looked around warily. Noticing that there weren't any other abnormalities, he retreated one step at a time until he felt his way to an upright metallic ladder. He decisively climbed up, moved the manhole cover away, and left the sewer. As he returned to Buckland Street, his dream shattered as he woke up. Klein opened his eyes and found himself in a dark room. As he looked at the ceiling adorned in gold, he recalled his encounter. This was done by that marauder pathway's demigod? He escaped the pursuit of the Nighthawks and is still hiding nearby. As he's afraid that the Black Emperor who exposed his whereabouts would appear again, he began steering dreams to seek out his target? Very possible. If it wasn't because I can maintain my reason and lucidity when others infiltrate my dreams, I might have been driven by my subconscious to place the explosives again. After all, this is something I've done before, and the memory is still fresh in my mind. Thankfully, I concluded the principle that a marionettist should try to hide behind the scenes. Be it my exploration of the sewers, or meeting with Trissy, I had relied on my marionette. Even if it's because of the distance, I didn't choose to do it personally and had instead used my spirit body with the gray fog as a proxy while carrying items that can interfere with the prying of secrets and divination, making it impossible to determine who is the true mastermind. I would have long been discovered and targeted. Even if I didn't die, I would have to flee Buckland in a pathetic manner. Upon thinking of this, Klein felt relieved. In the beginning, he wasn't certain of the secret hidden in the sewers. He had never expected it to be a demigod, but he had abided by the marionettist's principles and followed his strict requirements. Hence, he avoided the tragic outcome of having his act exposed. Buckland really is a dangerous place. Any mistake can result in trouble. As Klein reflected over the matter, he felt that his marionettist potion had unknowingly digested a little. After he composed himself, he chuckled inwardly. It appears that Demigod is still in Buckland Street. He's probably hiding in Hazel, or maybe even by her side. Heh, if that demigod had infiltrated my dream a minute or two earlier, he would have met Snake of Fate Wuxia Septon. Although this sequence 1 angel is still in a weak phase, that's only relative to other angels like Ouroboros. Faced with a sneaky demigod who can't even parasitize Hazel, there likely won't be any trouble. Ignoring the other powers, just revealing a full mythical creature state would be enough to deal tremendous damage to a demigod who's equally weak. I dare to bet that Wuxia Septon must have sensed it ahead of time to choose that time window to come out, thus, successfully avoiding an encounter with any other demigods. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to make that marauder demigod understand how dangerous it is to randomly infiltrate dreams in Buckland. Leonard definitely knows this very well. Klein reined in his thoughts and pretended as though nothing had happened. With cogitation, he fell asleep again. It was only when the sun rose high in the sky that he woke up naturally. He sat up, transformed into Gehrman Sparrow, and prayed, "Please inform Ma'am Hermit that the angel has accepted the method to regain a certain amount of strength during one's weak stages. He has agreed to complete the transaction in late June or early July. You can also ask Bernadette about when I can meet her." After completing the prayer, Klein transformed back into Dwayne Dantes, got out of bed, and entered the bathroom to wash up. After brushing his teeth and washing his face, thus, becoming abnormally alert, he took 4 steps counterclockwise and headed above the gray fog. He then threw the scene of the prayer into the crimson star representing the hermit. On the docked future, Katlia watched Frank Lee step on the dock while filled with anticipation. He planned on finding some place to sell his items and save up £8,000 to purchase the Druid Beyonder characteristic. She couldn't help but raise her hand to her forehead, feeling an inexplicable lack of confidence. Although she believed that she could suppress Frank Lee, even if he was a druid, thanks to her strength, mysticism knowledge, and mystical items, just the thought of his strange ideas, as well his terrifying ability to put them into action, made her feel that the problem wasn't that simple. She didn't wish for a watermelon to grow on her head or participate in the taro gathering above the gray fog while covered with ears of wheat. Thankfully, he still doesn't have the druid potion formula. For now, I don't have to worry about him advancing to sequence 5. Katlia nudged her glasses as she comforted herself. At this moment, an illusory fog emanated in front of her as Gehrman Sparrow's voice sounded in her ears. That angel agreed? Katlia's expression softened as she couldn't help smiling. Once she obtained that drop of mythical creature blood, it meant that she was very close to the realm of a demigod. She already had the mysticologist potion formula. She has also completed the necessary conditions to exchange for a main ingredient from the Moses ascetic order. She also knew of the channel to obtain the other main ingredient, as well as the method to obtain it. I just need to wait until July. July. Katlia pursed her lips as her gaze penetrated the thick glasses while she surveyed her captain's cabin. Thursday afternoon. Just as Klein finished a class on ancient literature, he heard the illusory, "Stacked please." After heading above the gray fog, he discovered that the supplicant was the hermit Katlia. Admiral of Stars had requested Mr. Fool to inform the world that Queen Mystic had agreed to his request. If he was in Buckland, they could meet near the entrance of the bridge on the south bank of the Tussock River at 11 in the evening. Bernadette is still in Buckland. Klein conjured Gehrman Sparrow and gave a confirmatory answer. At 10:58 p.m. he entered his bathroom and took out a paper figurine from his pocket. "Pa." Klein shook it and made the paper figurine turn into a Dwayne Dantes who sat on the toilet with a book in hand as though he was daydreaming. Then, he shortened himself by about 4 centimeters. His face turned thin as his facial contours became more pronounced. He had transformed into Gehrman Sparrow. Right on the heels of that, the glove on his left hand turned transparent as countless illusory figures appeared within. Following that, Klein saw the surrounding colors saturate before turning well separated and stacked. His body then phased away from the real world. He quickly traversed the spirit world, and, based on his location, kept adjusting his trajectory. In just a few seconds, he appeared at the south bank of the Tussock River where the Backlund Bridge entrance was. At that moment, it was already late at night. There was no one on the bridge, and it was extremely silent. The only thing that could be seen was a platoon of soldiers guarding the bridge a short distance away. Klein was just about to find Queen Mystic Bernadette's traces when he suddenly saw green pea vines droop down from the sky, interweaving to form a lush forest. This forest didn't have a peak as the veins formed different paths that either intersected or spiraled before extending high into the sky. Klein was taken aback for a second as he casually found a pea vine and hung over a tiny trail in midair before taking steps forward. After an unknown period of time, he saw that the green plants were connected to a seat that resembled a hammock. It was gently shaking above him. Queen Mystic was sitting there, wearing a white into-styled shirt and a dark black jacket. By her waist was a thin rapier. Other than not wearing a triangular hat, she was dressed like a standard pirate captain. She didn't only reveal her black leather boots like she did back when she interacted with Sherlock Moriarty in Backlund. At that moment, her chestnut hair cascaded down as her blue and deep eyes looked over. She gently said without any emotion, "Thank that existence behind you on my behalf. So you are still quite respectful towards the fool." The few answers I previously gave her had likely resolved some of her confusion. With the mask of Gehrman Sparrow on, Klein politely replied, "All right." Bernadette's eyes didn't shift as she continued looking at him. "Is there something this time?" Klein paused for a second as he said the words he had already prepared. "I wish to receive your help in reproducing the prolonged state of being contaminated by the core seal's power behind Cheney's gate of the Church of Evernight." As he spoke, Klein made Wraith Senior appear beside him. Bernadette looked deeply at the upright Admiral of Blood. Without asking Gehrman Sparrow how he knew that she had the means, she calmly said, "The core seals in the different cathedrals of the Church of Evernight are different. The state of contamination will also be different. Is it the Evernight pathway, the death pathway, or something else? Is it a main diocese cathedral, or a typical central cathedral in a city?" She had directly eliminated the option of the Church of Evernight's headquarters, the Cathedral of Serenity. This was because even a king of angels wouldn't cast their sights on it. Klein thought for a moment before saying, "Diocese Cathedral. Evernight pathway." Bernadette nodded gently and said, "Then, I can allow him to suffer the corresponding contamination, but doing so will basically destroy this marionette of yours. It can still be used normally in the beginning, but with the passage of time, the contamination will worsen. He will slowly fall asleep, never to awaken. Can the time it takes for the complete contamination be pushed back?" Klein asked, holding back the pain of potentially losing a marionette. Senor was one of the most valuable assets he had. Bernadette said with a calm expression, 2 months is the limit." Klein struggled inwardly for 2 seconds before replying in a deadpan manner, "All right." He then pressed his hand to his chest and bowed. "Thank you for your help." Bernadette didn't say a word as she retracted her gaze. She extended her right hand as words that were written in Jotun, Dragonese, Elvish, and ancient Hermes appeared in midair. These words interwove into strange symbols with a star-like radiance, as though they were opening a secret door that led deep into the spirit world. With the secret door opened, a gust of wind blew, conjuring the upper body of a man that was covered in white cloth. "Sleep bugle," Bernadette said gently but sternly. The man who had a torso and wind for his bottom replied reverently, pulling out a human skull from the white cloth. The skull's eye sockets were deeply recessed and dark, it was impossible to see the bottom. The rest of the skull was covered with holes of different shapes and cracks. It was white like a piece of jade. Bernadette took the sleep bugle and glanced at Gehrman Sparrow. "Go back at least 50 meters." Klein didn't ask why as he left Senor in his original spot, and he quickly distanced himself along the pea vine path. After exceeding 50 meters, he suddenly heard a distant and serene melody that was filled with sorrow and gloom. Subconsciously, Klein looked up at the area covered by the pea vines. Bernadette was sitting with her back slightly hunched. Her chestnut hair was fluttering as her head was bowed. She had placed the human skull to her mouth, letting the orifices produce an airstream that appeared like the orchestrated movement of the night. The movement brought with it the power of calmness and faint melancholy. Bit by bit, it spread out without alarming the soldiers guarding the bridge beyond the pea-vine forest. Klein stood there and listened seriously when he suddenly had a pining for home. That was home, something that a traveler who had been drifting for a long period of time yearned for the most but was unable to touch. Chapter 829, Arrival of June in the Dark Night, and within the green vine forest, Klein closed his eyes as he listened to that musical movement that was emitted from the sky. He felt calm in both body and mind, but he felt a faint sense of depression and sadness grow, emanate, and resonate. After an unknown period of time, the soothing melody finally disappeared as the hanging pea vines gently swayed in the night wind. Klein sighed silently as he opened his eyes and looked up. He saw that Queen Mystic Bernadette had handed over the orifice-filled human skull back to the servant that was half man, half wind. "It's done." Bernadette's gentle and calm voice sounded. "Thank you for your help." Klein bowed once again as he controlled Wraith Seigneur to return to his side. At this moment, the pea vines retracted upwards and slowly turned faint. Soon, the green forest vanished. Klein and Seigneur simultaneously landed at the entrance to the bridge. There was no one around this silent area, apart from a platoon of soldiers whose backs were facing him. There was nothing different from before. The fairy tale-like scene from before was like an illusion. Only then did Klein have the time to observe his marionette. He discovered that his marionette appeared more like a dead man than before. His face was pale and his aura cold. He gave off an obvious sense of gloom. This is likely the result of a single high dosage of contamination. If it's just guarding Cheney's gate for 1 to 2 times a week, with each duty happening during the day, it wouldn't be this serious. It's impossible that 2 months is the limit. If that's the case, even if it's the church of an orthodox deity, it won't be able to afford such losses. I expect a normal keeper to live for several years, or even more than 10 years. However, it's easy to mutate midway and lose control. Sigh, they likely already know of the outcome when they chose to become keepers. Klein felt poignant as he made Seigneur project himself onto the gold coin inside the iron cigar case. Following that, he used traveling to head out to sea. After selecting food for creeping hunger, he returned to his master bedroom's bathroom in 160 Baclun Street. June 5th. Sunday. Inside the Hall family castle. Audrey was sitting in front of a study desk as she admired the sight of the mystical item she had just acquired. Its outer appearance was that of a black fishnet glove that reached the elbow. It appeared to be a product of the royal family that came with a sense of magnificence and elegance. This was the item the artisan had made after some time, using the mentor of confusion Beyonder characteristic she had obtained from the world Gehrman Sparrow. Audrey had previously asked her father, Earl Hall, and obtained the answer, "You can buy it and use it for yourself." Having such filial thoughts is already good enough. Hence, she specially instructed Mr. Hanged Man to get the artisan to make it into an item that could be carried around by a lady. This also made her suspect if her father had better mystical items, or if the Church of the Goddess provided him rather high-level protection. Based on the Hanged Man's description, this fishnet glove gave the wearer several Beyonder powers. One of them was the enhancement of one's dignity and body, making surrounding beings lower their own standing to submit themselves without realizing it. Another was distort, the ability to distort a target's words, actions, and intent. It allowed one to formulate a certain order that provided them with an advantage. The third was bribe, which bribed them via a symbolic gesture. It allowed the target to feel a great sense of fondness, making it difficult to have any thoughts of animosity or even wish to fight the wearer. If the conditions were suitable, the person who received the bribe had an extremely small chance of attacking their companions. Audrey heard from Mr. World that this was one type of bribe Beyonder powers that was known as bribe charm. The last was to produce a chaos effect on a target or surrounding area, making it difficult for attacks to land on the wearer, and making the enemy easily choose to make the wrong judgment. Audrey was very satisfied with these effects. However, what vexed her was that the artisan's level was lacking. The Sequence 5 mystical item he created had relatively serious negative side effects. First, it would make the wearer's psyche slowly grow dark, making them often wish to take shortcuts, use schemes, or dishonorable methods to complete matters. Second, the wearer would enter a state of chaos after wearing it for more than 3 minutes. Audrey had tried it previously, and she had made a mistake without realizing it when she was bathing. The normal procedure was to let her maidservant fill the bathtub with water and adjust the temperature before she took off her clothes, enter the bathtub, and then finish washing up. However, Audrey had first entered the bathtub, filled it with cold water, and waited until her clothes were wet before she remembered to take them off. The only thing she was thankful about was that she had eventually controlled herself and hadn't called her lady's maid in to witness such an embarrassing matter. This makes me feel like a curly-haired baboon. Audrey thought in embarrassment and anger. She found the first negative effect acceptable because she was a psychiatrist. She could often check on herself and eliminate her dark thoughts. Furthermore, she had Susie to provide her with help as an onlooker. However, the second negative effect was completely unacceptable. The second negative effect is just too problematic. All I can do is bring it with me. I'll wear it at critical moments. Ah, right, I still have lie. It will amplify my emotions, so combined with the glove, it will only worsen the darkness in my heart. The current me might not be able to withstand it. Audrey's green eyes darted around as she tried thinking of a solution. At this moment, she heard knocking at the door. Her maidservant, Annie, said from the outside, "Miss Audrey, the Lord wishes to talk to you about something." Audrey left the black fishnet glove on the door as she stood up and came to the door to open it. Earl Hall, who didn't wear a coat at home except for a shirt and matching vest, touched his beautiful beard and said with a chuckle, "Are you not ready? We'll be returning to Backlund in a while. Tomorrow night will be your 18th birthday party." As he spoke, Earl Hall looked at Annie and company, indicating that they should retreat. "Sigh, it's the annual socializing season again." Audrey nodded, feigning her maturity. Earl Hall glanced at his daughter and asked with a laugh, "Have you thought of how you can make use of that item yet?" Audrey pursed her lips into a smile. "Of course. I plan on folding it up and putting it into a bag. Susie will carry it. This way, as she didn't wear it or use it, Susie wouldn't find herself in any situations of chaos and confusion, and its dark psychological problems could be treated by Audrey with placate. More importantly, without lie's amplification, Susie, who was also a psychiatrist, could also check on herself inwardly and regulate her mental state from time to time. Earl Hall was taken aback as he praised with a surprised smile, "That's a smart solution." Audrey felt smug, but she said in a reserved manner, "I plan on calling it the Hand of Horror." "Dear Earl, thank you for the birthday present. In a few more days, I can concoct the potion and attempt an advancement." Audrey added inwardly in joy. Sunday night. 160 Backlund Street. Klein stood on his balcony as he peeped at the street through the gap in the curtains. He couldn't help but feel somewhat nervous. If nothing unexpected happened, he planned on beginning his plan of stealing the Antigonus family's notebook in a while. With Queen Mystic Bernadette's help, he had made his marionette enter a contaminated state. From his frequent visits to the cathedral for praying, Bible studies, and donations, he had figured out the keeper's duty roster. There was only one thing left that was necessary for the preparations of Klein's theft. That was to secretly replace his target without anyone noticing it. Based on Klein's understanding of the situation, the keepers would head underground at daybreak. And it was during such times when the cathedral remained close. To directly infiltrate inside ran the risk of being discovered by a demigod like the diocese's archbishop. It could be said that there was no chance of success. Therefore, Klein's plan was to infiltrate the cathedral one day earlier and patiently wait for an opportunity. This undoubtedly needed a sufficient disguise, but this didn't stump a faceless. After observing for some time, Klein discovered that the church held a major mass on Sunday night. This was because Sunday and the night were symbols for the goddess. And after the mass ended, the servants would be busy clearing the trash and throwing them outside. Klein's plan was to seize this opportunity to knock a servant unconscious and enter the cathedral while disguised as the servant before sleeping in the servants' quarters. For this, he had even purchased a dosage that was able to let a person fall into a deep sleep for 10 hours without causing any physical harm. He bought it from Emlyn for £5. Phew. After a few minutes, Klein slowly exhaled as he drew the curtains. He walked back to his bedroom, took 4 steps counterclockwise, and went above the grey fog. Sitting in the fool's chair, he thought in silence for a minute before conjuring a pen and paper. He wrote the divination statement: "This theft of the Antigonus family's notebook will be dangerous." After putting down the dark red fountain pen, Klein removed the spirit pendulum from his left wrist. Using his left hand to hold the chain, he let the topaz hang down over the paper in close proximity with it. He entered cogitation, closed his eyes, and silently chanted the divination statement. After repeating it 7 times, he slowly opened his eyes and saw the spirit pendulum spinning clockwise with an ordinary amplitude and frequency. "There's danger, but it's within an acceptable range." Klein quickly made an interpretation. In fact, he was a little worried if his divination was being interfered with, just like how the Mother Tree of Desire had done so. However, he had no way of verifying it, much less falsify the possibility. Therefore, when the divination outcome, plans, and preparations satisfied the required conditions, Klein had made up his mind. He looked at the hanging topaz that slowly came to a halt. In Chinese, he said in a heavy voice, "A strung bow is poised to strike." Before he finished his sentence, Klein let his spirituality envelop himself as he simulated the feeling of falling, and he returned to the real world. This time, he planned on only bringing 3 items with him: creeping hunger, Señor's gold coin, and Azek's copper whistle. The characteristic they had in common was that they could be stored inside an iron cigar case. He could use Paper Angel and a wall of spirituality to provide a double layer of screening. As for the other items, there was a high chance that they couldn't pass through Chinese Gate, as they could easily trigger an anomaly at the core seal. Therefore, Klein had left the rest of his items, as well as his money, above the grey fog, prepared to immediately flee if anything went wrong. It's just that the 3% coin company shares worth £12,800 is tied to Dwayne Dantes' identity. Klein quickly reined in his thoughts, picked up a mirror, and placed it on the pillow. Following that, he drew the mysterious symbol used for summoning erodes. Chapter 830, Infiltration. The mirror on Klein's pillow glowed with an aqueous luster as silver points of light gathered to form Loanese words: "Exalted Great Master, your loyal and humble servant, Erodes, is constantly at your service." Klein stood beside the bed and looked at the mirror before calmly asking, "Where is the Antigonus family's notebook located behind St. Samuel Cathedral's Chinese Gate?" He wanted to confirm the location so that he could directly head for his target and complete his plan in the shortest time possible. Through this, he could avoid all kinds of accidents. Silver text distorted and changed on the mirror's surface, forming a new line of text. "It's a grade 1 sealed artifact. It will be on the right in basement 2. I can't see anything more specific." Klein tersely acknowledged as he said, "It's your turn to ask." Erodes immediately dispersed the silver words and presented a new question: "What other instructions do you have?" If this were any other time, Klein definitely would have secretly sked, but his high-strung mind made him nod. "Just watch over my illusion like before to deal with any accidents." "All right, Master." Erodes didn't hesitate to give an answer as it hurriedly added, "I will hold back my instincts. I swear to you, the great ruler above the spirit world." Klein nodded gently, took 2 steps forward, and made the mirror look like Dwayne Dantes. The image became clearer and bigger until it looked real. After some slight adjustments, Klein made it lie in bed as though it was already sleeping. At this moment, he saw Dwayne Dantes turn his head over and smile at him with a toady look. At the same time, he reached out his hands and pulled the blanket towards his head. Without a word, Klein transformed into the cold and crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow, as creeping hunger on his left hand turned transparent. His body rapidly phased away as he traveled to the other end of Phelps Street where St. Samuel Cathedral was. Following that, he walked to the square filled with pigeons in the day, and he hid himself in a corner under the guise of the shadows. A short while later, a batch of believers who had attended Mass came out of the cathedral. Before long, servants began leaving the cathedral with all sorts of miscellaneous items, walking to the trash bins in an alley. A number of people were dealing with the feces that was found at the spot where the carriages parked at. At this moment, a servant's body suddenly trembled before he bowed his head. He seriously began cleaning the area, and he even proactively walked towards the square as though he wanted to clean the trash there. He slowly opened up a distance from the others until he came to a shadowy area. When the other servants stopped placing their attention on him, a hand suddenly outlined itself and reached out of the void, grabbing him by the shoulder and causing his body to phase away into nothingness. Klein had directly traveled to a cheap 2-bedroom condominium in East Borough. He had teleported over a few days ago with another identity to rent it. A traveler's ability is really convenient. The only problem is that I need to have a pirate sacrifice his life every time. Klein lampooned to relieve his anxiety as he made the servant lie in bed. Then, he took out a long metal vial and threw it at him. The servant caught it and pulled out the stopper before gulping down the soporific medicine in it. In a few seconds, he fell into a deep slumber as Senor surfaced to the side. Klein observed the servant on the bed as his body suddenly softened like he had transformed into a slime monster. However, he didn't collapse into a pool. After some swaying, he instantly shortened his height by 15 centimeters as his skin darkened in color. His facial features moved, and soon, he had transformed into the servant. And at this moment, Senor had already taken off the servant's clothes. Without wasting any time, Klein quickly changed into those clothes and moved the items from the iron cigar case over. Picking up the broom and surveying the area before confirming that there weren't any problems, he made Senor return to the gold coin before Klein lowered his left arm and spread his fingers. He watched as creeping hunger produced an indescribable transparency effect. After teleporting back to the shadowy corner, Klein bent his back and began cleaning the area seriously. Step by step, he approached the busy servants but maintained a distance from them to prevent anyone from chatting with him, which would increase his chances of being exposed. After about 30 minutes, the servants gathered together and entered St. Samuel Cathedral and turned into a side door. At a distance away from the priests, a servant stretched his arms and said, "How tiring." Klein pretended to look uninterested in the conversation due to his fatigue as he tersely nodded without participating in the conversation. Soon, they returned to the servants' quarters. It comprised of 2 rather big rooms, with many bunk beds inside. Beside each bed was a wardrobe and chest. Klein was immediately at a loss. He didn't know whether to head left or right. Thankfully, he was a seer. He could solely rely on his spiritual intuition on matters that didn't involve beyonders or mysterious domains. Furthermore, he was still holding onto a broom. Hence, he pretended to have his hand slip and secretly did a dowsing rod seeking. He received a revelation that he should head right. When he entered the room on the right, Klein deliberately slowed down a little, observing the actions of the other servants. Then, he mimicked them by placing the broom in the region behind the door. Then, he went outside to the common bathroom to wash his face, rinse his mouth, and wash his feet. After he completed all of this in a slow manner, the bed that belonged to him revealed itself, the bed that wasn't occupied. Lying in bed, Klein finally felt relieved as he secretly sighed in relief. The servants were all exhausted and before long, they fell asleep, producing a symphony of snores. Klein maintained his consciousness and very slowly removed creeping hunger. Folding it up into a tiny shape, he stuffed it inside the iron cigar case, putting it together with Azek's copper whistle and Senor's gold coin. Seconds turned to minutes as he found it impossible to sleep due to anxiety. All he could do was rely on cogitation to force himself to sleep for a few hours. He woke up at a specific time and released Senor. This marionette's cold aura rapidly melded with the surroundings as the spirit body threads collapsed inwardly, gradually turning black without any origins. It can still be controlled. Klein nodded indiscernibly and made the wraith use the stained glass windows high above and the bright stone floor tiles to arrive at the staircase that led to the keepers above. He believed that if Senor hadn't been contaminated ahead of time, making Cheney's gate's core seal think of it as one of its own, it definitely would have reacted and cleansed it. How could a wraith have the ability to move freely in an Orthodox church's cathedral? And due to the tacit approval from the core seal and the disruption from the paper angel, the demigod-level archbishop that lived somewhere in the cathedral wasn't alerted. Under Klein's control, and using the sensations from the contamination, the invisible Senor slowly walked to the second floor before turning left and finding the residence of the keepers. It's Monday tomorrow. This week's Monday shift is likely done by the keeper I met first. Klein had long figured out the roster, so he made the dark red-coated wraith stealthily pass through the wooden door and float into different rooms to identify the target. As there were only a few people inside, he quickly found the pale elder with loose facial skin, sparse hair, and a big nose. Senor immediately took out a sedative vial and placed it to the side. Then, before the keeper sensed anything, it possessed him. The keeper, who was in deep sleep, lost control over his body before he could even wake up to resist. All he could do was open his grayish-blue eyes and watch himself slowly pick up the vial and pull off the stopper. Then, he downed the liquid inside. His body convulsed abnormally as his organs seemed to be engaged in a violent struggle. After a full minute, he slowly went limp and closed his eyes again, entering a dreamless sleep. After doing all of this, Senor left the body of the keeper and used all kinds of mirror surfaces to leap back to the servants' quarters before entering Klein's body. Klein immediately emitted a cold, dead, and distant aura. Even showing an expression appeared to be difficult. He slowly got out of bed and silently left the servants' quarters. In the shadows and murals that weren't illuminated by the moonlight, he walked to the second floor and entered the target's room. Standing by the bedside, Klein, whilst in the appearance of a servant, slowly grew taller as his hair turned gray and sparse while his nose enlarged significantly. In just a few seconds, he looked identical to the keeper who just drank the sedative. Even his aura was identical. Changing into the black clergyman's coat that was placed to the side, Klein moved the keeper's and servants' clothes underneath the bed and laid down as he kept note of the time. At 5:30, he woke up ahead of time, finishing the white bread he had prepared the night before and drank a cup of water. He then looked quietly out the window. Just as day broke, Klein maintained his deadpan state and walked out the door. He went to the first floor, and following the path he had previously verified, he took a left turn. After walking for a moment, he wasn't surprised to see a priest. This was his experience as a former Nighthawk, therefore, Klein wasn't too worried that he couldn't find the path. The priest stood outside a secret door that led underground. As he raised his right hand, he tapped 4 times clockwise on his chest and said, "May the goddess bless you." "Praise the lady," Klein replied hoarsely and similarly drew a crimson moon. He didn't stay any longer and walked past the priest. Under the lamps that lined the walls, he walked down the staircase and arrived at the crossroads. Based on his understanding of his environment, Klein believed that turning right would leave the cathedral, and it would likely lead to the disguised security company or other organization belonging to the Nighthawks. Therefore, he didn't hesitate to turn left. At that moment, he saw a man wearing a red glove walk over. The casually dressed man had black hair and green eyes with handsome looks. He was none other than Leonard Mitchell. Chapter 831. Just inches away. Upon seeing Leonard, Klein's back muscles instantly stiffened. His nerves tensed up like a fully drawn bow that could snap at any moment. He remembered very clearly that Leonard had a marauder pathway angel, Palez Zoroast, parasitizing him. He could sense the uniqueness about his body and, from that, see through his disguise. If that grandpa were to inform Leonard of the problem with the keeper in front of him, that would be troublesome. "I'll just have to hope that my dear poet is afraid that his secret will be exposed and that he would feign ignorance." Back in Tingen, although he often said that everyone has their secrets and that there's no need to worry about it, that's all regarding matters pertaining to the church. Who knows if he suddenly feels the need to uphold justice and decides to be loyal and take the risk to expose me. After all, this matter is very similar with Insanguils. At that moment, Klein's forehead nearly broke out into a sweat. To be frank, he never expected to encounter Leonard while heading to Cheney's Gate because he was a Red Glove and not an ordinary Nighthawk. There was no need for him to be on duty, so there wasn't a need for him to be here at that moment in time. However, Klein immediately thought of a crucial point. The one who could detect his uniqueness was Palaz Zorost and not Leonard Mitchell. The former's attitude was more important. The grandpa knows that I know of his existence. Once he exposes my disguise and pushes me into a corner, he has to be prepared to be exposed by me. When the time comes, we will definitely be trading blows with each other, benefiting no one. And for an angel from the Marauder pathway who doesn't believe in the goddess, there's no need for that. If I were him, I would pretend that nothing had happened. I wouldn't even remind Leonard Mitchell, leaving my safety to be decided by my host. As he quickly cleared his train of thought, Klein composed himself and walked over towards the red-gloved Leonard Mitchell. Leonard indifferently looked at the keeper with grizzled sparse hair. He couldn't help but raise his right hand to cover his mouth and yawn. He has nothing better to do because he doesn't sleep at night, so he'd gone to the duty room to play cards with the person on duty? What a perfect sleepless. Klein roughly understood the reason for the Red Glove poet appearing. He recalled the reactions of the keepers when they met Nighthawks in Tingen. He silently nodded his head at Leonard and drew a moon with his right index and middle finger, tapping his chest 4 times in a clockwise manner. Leonard used the same action in response as he passed by the keeper without noticing anything. Klein silently exhaled as he maintained his usual pace and gait until he reached his destination. The iron-black double door was heavy and cold. Engraved on it were 7 sacred emblems appearing as though nothing could stir it. Klein turned his body to the side and took 2 steps to the side. He knocked on the keeper's door, and under the gaze of the Nighthawk on duty, he opened Cheney's Gate. The darkness deep inside immediately surged out. Even though there were silver candles with engraved patterns burning silently inside, they were unable to disperse such a feeling. And the ghostly blue flame accentuated the deathly silence. Meanwhile, Klein felt that something invisible in the darkness was grazing past his skin and entering deep into his body. It passed through the boundary of reality and illusions, connecting to Wraith Senor. Suddenly, without even activating his spirit vision, he saw black threads covering the area behind Cheney's Gate. They were gently swaying, either bundled or extended out as though a lady was spreading out her hair, or some monster was flailing its tentacles. Klein walked forward with a deadpan expression. After entering the sealed land, he turned around and closed Cheney's Gate. At that moment, all the sounds outside were completely cut off. The silence inside was like a kingdom of the dead. It made him imagine and feel fear. Klein was reminded of himself occasionally watching the darkness in bed with his eyes open. He didn't dare to sleep even though he hadn't heard any ghost stories. It's no wonder the goddess has the title of Empress of Horror. Klein cast his gaze to the side and raised the lantern in the corner, lighting it with great familiarity. Dim yellow light immediately poured out before being tainted with a ghostly blue. Klein, who was wearing a black clergyman's robe, wasn't in a rush to head for basement 2 to search for the Antigonus family's notebook. Instead, he stayed behind the gate and patiently waited. He was doing so in the event that the Nighthawks were in urgent need of something but could only wait until daybreak since they were unable to retrieve them at night. Based on his experience, keepers were most easily disturbed in the first 5 minutes of them entering Cheney's Gate. As long as he survived that period, and as long as there weren't any additional accidents, the normal retrieval process of materials would happen after 8. That was the standard working hours of the Nighthawks and civilian staff. In other words, once Klein lasted the first 5 minutes, he wouldn't be disturbed by the Nighthawks for the next 2 hours. Of course, he didn't have that much time for his operation. The Church of Evernight opened at 8, and the servants would wake up an hour or an hour and a half ahead of time to get down to work. After 6:30, the other servants could realize that one of them was missing. Time ticked by as Klein's heartbeat couldn't help but speed up. He found the 5 minutes excruciating. Finally, his countdown finally ended as he cast his gaze towards the stone stairs in the darkness. It was the passage that led to the second floor. At that moment in time, there was no one in here that could restrict him. At this stage, Klein believed that he had overcome 70% of the difficulties. The remaining 30% consisted of how he would leave after obtaining the notebook. Of course, there was always a certain chance for all kinds of accidents to happen. Klein didn't wish to be careless as he raised a lantern and walked to the stone staircase. To other Beyonders, the first level behind Cheney's gate was actually a lot more attractive than the sealed artifacts. There were all kinds of Beyonder ingredients, potion formulas, and secret knowledge here. There were even captured heretics that had been apprehended, as well as unaffiliated Beyonders. Be it trying to be rich, to advance, or to rescue their companions, an infiltrator just needed to search around this level. However, Klein needed to head deeper inside where the dangerous items were sealed. Passing through a few tightly locked stone chambers, he clearly sensed people inside. However, they weren't making a fuss or roaring, nor were they pleading for mercy or shouting for help. They were silently lying there or sitting there. Their auras had already turned cold. The lantern's light flickered as it illuminated the staircase that led down. Klein focused again and steadily walked deeper underground. He didn't run, afraid that he would trigger a negative reaction from the core seal. As it became darker, the ghostly blue flames from the elegant candle stands on the two ends had weakened. They appeared as though they were about to be extinguished at any moment. And at that moment, the pure darkness might bring about unimaginable horrific changes. Klein repressed his instinctive fear as he finally walked down the stairs and came to basement 2. With a wraith's night vision, Klein discovered that there were strange walls made of steel, bricks, mud, and silver. They were sectioned off into different regions, with certain spots open and other rooms tightly shut. All of them had a sealed artifact. With the lantern in hand, he turned left as the scene before Klein's eyes lit up. He saw a burning flame and a glowing red and black anthracite and charcoal. The region was in a half-open state. Inside was a bathtub-like object made of steel. The area beneath it was dug open and was stuffed with anthracite, charcoal, and other flammable objects. They kept burning, making the steel bathtub produce bubbling sounds, letting the steam emanate out, condensing on the ceiling and dripping down like rain. An artifact that needs to be soaked in hot water for the seal. And the keepers need to periodically add anthracite and charcoal to prevent the fire from extinguishing. If there's a sealed artifact that can constantly emit high temperatures, they can be placed together, making the seal easy. Klein glanced at the steel bathtub. Hoping that no accident spoiled his plans, he approached it and used a tool to add some anthracite into the fire pit. When he looked up, he noticed something through the corner of his eye. Immersed under the hot water in the bathtub was a silver metallic object. Together, they seemed to form a heavy full-body armor. And a part of it had unremovable dark red blood stains and splattered red spots. 1-42. An ancient god's blood. So now it's permanently stored in the Backlund diocese. Klein had seen this sealed artifact before as the corresponding information surfaced in his mind. Just as he was about to retract his gaze, he saw the Spartan's silver helmet. The helmet's visor had been pulled down, making its interior appear dark. At that instant, Klein felt that a gaze was penetrating it and casting itself on him. He trembled as he hurriedly took 2 steps back, his heartbeat racing erratically. Not daring to observe it any further, Klein composed himself and cast his gaze forward as he steadily walked forward and left the area. After passing through a few sealed areas, his spiritual perception was triggered. He felt that something on the right was summoning him. Furthermore, it was producing the beating sounds of an expanding and contracting heart. Indeed, the Antigonus family's notebook has been waiting for me all this time. Klein silently confirmed his earlier theory, and following the illusory summoning, he changed direction and approached it. In just 2 or 3 minutes, he saw a room with an ajar stone door. It was dark inside without any source of light. With the lantern's illumination, an empty bookshelf formed from white bone appeared in Klein's eyes. On it was an ancient notebook in a black hardcover. It was the Antigonus family's notebook. Hornacis. Phlegria. Hornacis. Phlegria. Illusory voices drilled into Klein's ears as he confirmed his target. Things happened very smoothly, but Klein didn't dare to be careless or rash. He carefully entered the room as he slowly approached, afraid that the mechanism that sealed the Antigonus family's notebook would inflict harm to him. Hence, when he closed in, a hand in a dark red sleeve suddenly reached out from his abdomen. It was Wraith Seigneur's hand. One of the principles of a marionettist, use as a marionette as much as possible in situations that a marionette could be used. If anything were to happen, the marionette would bear the brunt. At this moment, there was a slam from the direction of the door as though someone had walked in. Klein's pupils dilated as he lunged for the bone shelf without any thought, making the marionette's hand by his abdomen grab the Antigonus family's notebook. At the same time, his right hand reached into his clothes and opened the iron cigar case and wore creeping hunger. He was attempting to teleport directly outside before the core seal reacted. During this process, a scene of the door naturally appeared in his mind. A figure wearing a hooded classical robe was standing there. The figure had a pretty face that wore a lifeless expression. The deep black eyes lacked any spirituality. That high-ranking member of the church that directly wiped Mr. A out of existence and ended the great smog of Backlund? Why would she be hiding underground? That's not logical. Just as a sense of horror emerged in Klein's heart, he instinctively lowered his head to look at his body. His body was rapidly being wiped away like an eraser erasing a pencil drawing. Before he could touch the Antigonus family's notebook, he had completely vanished. Chapter 832, Town. Before his brain short-circuited, Klein only had time for two thoughts: how powerful. There's no way to resist. I wonder if I can be revived from such a death. As his thoughts resonated, Klein's vision turned pitch black. He lost all his senses as he entered a dreamless slumber. After an unknown period of time, the silent darkness suddenly stirred. He vaguely felt a sense of grogginess as he felt a cold wind blow at him. As his thoughts thawed bit by bit, Klein slowly opened his eyes and saw fog everywhere above him. The crimson moon was hidden in it, occasionally showing itself. Did I just resurrect again? Or have I entered the underworld? Even if it's the latter, that's not too problematic. I might even be able to get the skeleton messenger to contact Mr. Azek. However, I'll have to become an undead creature or spirit world creature. Klein's mind was still a little heavy, as though someone had injected glue into his brain, preventing him from expanding on his thoughts. Slowly, he sensed his body and heard his heart beating. His mind quickly turned lucid as he believed that the possibility of him resurrecting was higher. Perhaps, he had been thrown out into the wilderness. Pa! Klein's joints produced a crack as he jumped to his feet. Without checking his physical condition, he first observed his surroundings and confirmed the type of environment he was in. The first thing he saw was a fog that permeated the area and the dark and stillness of the night. And close by was a tiny town. The most striking building in the town was an extremely ancient spired cathedral. It was completely black in color. There wasn't a bell tower, and at the top of it were pitch-black ravens spiraling around it. Around the cathedral were many buildings. They were normal two-story residences and simple wooden huts. There were bread shops with hanging signboards and grayish-white mills using water wheels for power. However, there wasn't a single pedestrian. They seemed to be asleep in the quietness of the night. As a seer, Klein instantly found the town very familiar, as though he had seen it somewhere in the past. After a brief recall, he remembered what it represented. This was the source of danger of the nighttime in the ruins of the Battle of Gods. After entering the easternmost region of the Sonia Sea, if one didn't sleep and enter a dream world when night fell, it would be discovered that the person would have gone missing once it was daytime. Klein had once been jolted awake in a dream with the Saint of Darkness, and he saw in the distance a place which was enshrouded in the tranquility of the night. There was a mysterious and bizarre foggy town. He even suspected that all the living beings that vanished at night in the ruins had entered the town. Now, he was there himself. He was less than 100 meters from the foggy town. It's related to the night. The target vanishes like it was erased. The power of that high-ranking member of the church doesn't directly kill her enemies, and she instead sends them here? Do the living beings that vanish at night in the ruins also encounter such situations? But it's said that there's no way to obtain their whereabouts via divination. The only interpretation they can conclude is that they might still be alive. Of course, it's also possible that I can be resurrected, thus, appearing here. Amidst his thoughts, Klein retracted his gaze and used his ability as a clown to observe his physical condition. He had already changed back into Klein Moretti, but he was still wearing the keeper's black clergyman robe. He didn't have any signs of an injury on him. Filled with experience, Klein quickly calmed down. His right hand reached into his pocket and opened the iron cigar case. He took out the folded human-skinned glove and wore it on his left hand. After confirming that creeping hunger could still be used, Klein lifted Azek's copper whistle and blew into it. However, the skeleton messenger didn't appear in the spirit vision he quickly activated. Klein wasn't too surprised with such an outcome. Instead, he found it normal. After all, the people who had vanished on the eastern front of the Sonia Sea had yet to be found. After all, over the years, there was likely no lack of beyonders here who could summon messengers, such as the members of the numinous episcopate. This place is directly isolated from the spirit world? From the looks of it, traveling can't be used. As expected of a high-ranking member the church sent to deal with the great smog of Backlund. She sends her targets here as a form of eternal exile or imprisonment. It's impossible to use ordinary or simple means to contact the outside world. To escape from this place, even saints will find it difficult. Klein didn't lose himself to anxiety as he still felt confident. He placed Azek's copper whistle back into the iron cigar case and prepared to take 4 steps counterclockwise. He wanted to head above the gray fog to escape the imprisonment of the fog town. Blessings stem from the immortal Lord of heaven and earth. Blessings stem from the sky Lord of heaven and earth. Blessings stem from the exalted the arch of heaven and earth. Blessings stem from the celestial worthy of heaven and earth. With 1 sentence per step, Klein rapidly completed the ritual. However, he didn't hear the familiar, frenzied ravings. Nor did he see the endless emanating grayish-white fog. Klein's pupils constricted as he fell into a momentarily daze. This place was isolated from the mysterious space above the gray fog. This made his greatest trump card unusable. Klein had relied on the area above the gray fog to escape danger many times in the past. But this time, this solution was ineffective. This was the first time he was encountering such a situation. Man, it feels as though my cheat has been blocked. Klein lampooned to relax his tense emotions. Based on his knowledge of mysticism, he suspected that the foggy town was likely related to a true deity because this was the only explanation as to why he couldn't head above the gray fog. This place has close ties to the night. I was sent here after encountering a high-ranking member. Could it be a prison that the goddess created herself? But she is the mother of concealment. Perhaps she can directly make people or items enter a concealed state, making people in the real world never able to find them again. Klein seriously contemplated and decisively decided to explore the foggy town. This was because the method to leave this place was most likely to be there. At this point, he was no longer worried about not being able to convene the tarot club. Of course, there was no need for him to worry about it for now. He had cancelled the coming tarot gathering ahead of time because the operation of stealing the Antigonus family's notebook was fraught with danger and variables. Klein suspected that he might end up dead and be unable to resurrect in time. Therefore, he used a reasonable excuse to get everyone to make additional preparations for a week. After making up his mind, Klein immediately got the wraith inside him to float beside him. The marionette's condition was already in a terrible state. The dead and cold aura was something substantial, making his control of the spirit body thread somewhat rough. Thankfully, I can still use him for a few more days. Also, Mr. A was erased by that high-ranking church member. He might be living nearby. I have to be careful about this person who's equivalent to a lunatic. Klein transformed into Gehrman Sparrow as he made Senor walk ahead and enter the foggy town. Following the marionettist principle he had concluded, he stood in the back with a distance of at least 110 meters between them. Over time, his digestion had increased his control over his marionette to 120 meters. There was also a reduction in the time needed to gain initial control of spirit-body threads and completely change someone into a marionette. Faced with an enemy whose spirit body was equally strong, the former took 16 seconds, and the latter took 4 minutes. In the silent foggy world, Senor, in his dark red coat and old triangular hat, didn't take long to enter the bizarre and mysterious town. Many of the building doors were still open as though they were welcoming guests from afar. With his marionette's vision, Klein saw that there was a half-chewed loaf of white bread on the table. There were wine glasses for red wine and messy silver cutlery. It looked like someone had been enjoying dinner, but there was no one present. The owners of these different houses seemed to have suddenly vanished into thin air. Vanished. This term suddenly surfaced in Klein's mind as he hurriedly made Senor cast his gaze towards the grayish-white mill. Inside the mill, the wind-powered mill was rotating silently, but other than the floor that was scattered with flour, no flour came out again. This scene feels familiar. I seem to have heard of it before. Klein frowned bit by bit. As he relied on his marionette, he continued surveying his environment while carefully recalling the similar situation. Just as he was considering using dream divination to question his spirituality, he found the corresponding answer. A similar scene had appeared in the ancient ruins that appeared at the main peak of the Hornaces mountain range. Based on the literature, the buildings there had every arrangement and decoration well preserved. Even the wall murals didn't have any signs of damage. The table was arranged with cutlery, and there were dried stains of rot on the dining plates. In some rooms, there were half-filled bottles of alcohol that had almost turned into plain water. The discoverer mentioned that when he first discovered the remains, he even had the belief that the people residing there had just vanished all of a sudden. There's some relation between this foggy town and the main peak of the Hornaces mountain range? No way, after trying to avoid it, I ended up coming to it. Klein's facial features twitched involuntarily. For a moment, he couldn't believe what was on his mind. Of course, the scene was just similar and wasn't enough to make him come up with such a conclusion. After taking a deep breath and slowly exhaling, Klein forced himself to calm down. He controlled Wraith Senor and made him venture deeper into the foggy town. At that moment, he heard light footsteps. Klein's heart tensed up as he hurriedly hid inside the mill and made his marionette stop. In just a few seconds, Wraith Senor saw a woman walk out from a nearby alley. She wore a pure white robe, and her hair was pulled back, revealing her long, white neck. She looked extremely beautiful. Chapter 833, Things to Take Note of. Inside the dark, foggy town, the woman who walked out of the alley seemed to be out of place with her surroundings. She was pure, stately, and untainted. She was so gorgeous that it lit up the eyes of anyone whose gaze landed on her. As for her pure, simple robe and her loosely pulled back hair, they added to her bearing and languidness. That gorgeous woman also noticed Senor. Her expression froze for a moment before she smiled. Using a sweet voice, she said, "Senor, when did you become a marionette? If not for the powers of Evernight contaminating you this badly, I wouldn't have recognized you." Although she looked like she was talking to Senor, she was actually conversing with the controller through the marionette. Sigh, this kind of dead and cold aura can't be hidden at all. I can't fool Beyonders of higher sequences. I was still hoping that I could hide somewhere inconspicuous and use Admiral of Blood Senor to make contact with her so as to maximize my own safety. This place screens away the power of the gray fog, so if I were to die, I likely won't be able to resurrect. Klein hid inside the grayish-white mill and made his marionette speak hoarsely. If you could leave, you'd easily find out that I'd been serving my master more than a month ago. He used Admiral of Blood's tone and experiences to answer as though he was still alive. This was the acting principle of a marionettist, to let each marionette have their unique identity and setting. Meanwhile, Klein also buried a keyword, leave, in preparation to broach the topic of leaving. In this bizarre and mysterious town, he didn't have thoughts of instantly killing any demoness that he saw. Ignoring the question of there being any good demonesses and whether he was equipped with the strength to do so, just the fact that they were trapped in here had made it imperative that he communicated with her for intelligence to seek a way to get out. This was enough to make him choose peaceful coexistence for the time being. The woman in a simple white robe chuckled and said, not forgetting to constantly act. From the looks of it, you will quickly digest the marionettist potion. A member of the secret order? She's very familiar with the seer pathway. The Demonist sect was a secret organization that was active in the Fourth Epoch. Even if they didn't have close ties with the Zeradal or Antigonus families, they should be quite familiar with each other. It's very normal to understand the seer pathway. Of course, the premise to that is that this lady is a demoness. Klein's heart stirred as he deliberately asked, aren't there other possibilities? He tried to sound her out to see if other organizations might wield control over the seer pathway. The beautiful and pure lady walked forward and leaned towards Admiral of Blood Senor as she said with a smile, it doesn't matter which organization you belong to. We have been exiled here, and it's practically eternal imprisonment. The past no longer matters, what matters is the future, whether we can cooperate to find a way of leaving. I failed to sound her out. Klein made the wraith reply, that's exactly what I was thinking. How may I address you? As the lady approached Senor, Klein caught a whiff of a refreshing fragrance with his marionette sense of smell. Due to her words, he suddenly had a baffling thought to help each other in such a perilous situation while abandoning all morals, to help warm up each other's souls with their bodies. She's like a demoness. Her voice sounds more familiar the more I listen to her. But why can't I put my thumb on it? What a pity, there's no way to use dream divination in such a situation. She will be able to seize the opportunity while I'm unconscious, and it's hard to predict what will happen. Klein frowned slightly. This beautiful woman with a tinge of languidness raised her hand to stroke her hair, accentuating her petite ear. Panatia. What about you? Klein had originally planned on randomly choosing a disguise, such as the Aurora Order's Mr. X or Death Announcer's second mate, Curtius. After all, he could use creeping hunger to simulate their powers, but he ultimately gave up the disguise and directly said, Gehrman Sparrow. He didn't know when this suspected demoness had entered the foggy town, so he was unable to eliminate the possibility that she knew about Admiral of Blood's disappearance. Panatia nodded and asked, how did you get in? Klein didn't keep the truth from her as he said with the marionette's mouth, I encountered an unknown lady. She wore a hood, and her eyes were like the night, but it lacked any spirituality. Panatia fell silent for 2 seconds before saying, so it's her. Heh, she didn't continue in detail as she said with a smile, what did you actually do? You actually managed to get the Church of Evernight to send her to deal with you? Panatia had changed the pronoun she used. Her. That lady is an angel? An ascetic from the church? Panatia seems to know much about her. Klein's thoughts whirred as he said vaguely, I infiltrated St. Samuel Cathedral and attempted to steal a sealed artifact, but in the end, he didn't go into the details, because he had no idea how he encountered the lady. Klein believed that as an angel, it was impossible for the lady to keep living behind St. Samuel Cathedral's Chinese gate. There was nothing in there that required an important figure like her to keep watch on the entire time. Is that so? So, she is indeed in the basement of Samuel Cathedral. Panatia seemed to confirm something. In secret organizations, the word saint is not used when talking about St. Samuel Cathedral. I should take note of this detail in the future. Klein ruminated over her choice of words. Panatia didn't continue on the topic as she said with a smile, all right, let's not bother with the past. Just as I said, what's important is the future and how we can escape. Klein used this opportunity to make Senor ask, what do you know about this place? Panatia glanced at the spired cathedral in the middle of the town and said, "This place isn't the real or spirit world, nor is it the astral world. It's in some kind of secret, hidden state. I've explored most of this area, including the area outside the town. I didn't manage to find any clues. All that's left is that cathedral. Perhaps all the secrets are hidden inside. Why don't you explore the cathedral?" Klein asked with his marionette's mouth. Panatia yanked her pure white robe. On it were signs of wear and tear. "My intuition tells me that there's extreme danger inside." Upon saying that, she switched topics. "And now, there's a solution. Your marionette can help us scout. Even if it's lost, it wouldn't deal you any harm. Don't worry. As long as we gain an understanding of the situation inside, I'll find a chance to give you a better marionette. After all, it doesn't look like it can last long. There's nothing unreasonable about that, but I don't trust you. After all, you are most likely a demoness." Klein didn't agree or object to it as he took the opportunity to get Seigneur to ask, "Are there any things to take note of while in here?" Panatia pursed her lips and said, "Due to various reasons, a sizable number of people end up here, but they have all vanished." "All vanished?" Klein's heart palpitated as he asked, "What happened?" Panatia sighed and said, "There are things I'm not sure about. Some entered those buildings and ate some of the food inside. Then, they vanished, instantly. And this time, the results of divination indicate that they've lost their lives and are undergoing eternal sleep. There will be erasure and vanishing events in this foggy town. Furthermore, they will no longer exist." Klein was horrified before he thought of another matter. He nearly blurted it out. "Won't you feel hungry?" Afraid that it would result in an anomaly, he forcefully held his tongue and made Seigneur ask her indirectly, "How long have you been in here?" As though sighing and laughing, Panatia said, "Perhaps it's been half a year. I've witnessed many people cannibalize others for sustenance. Thankfully, I don't need much and can live very long with a bit of food. And on a human's body, there is food that won't damage the body too significantly." As she spoke, she raised her hand and pointed at the crimson moon hanging behind the fog. "Another thing to take note of is that once the crimson moon turns clear, there will be changes here. It will become extremely dangerous. I've been severely injured as a result." As she said that, she turned to point at a tear in her pure white robe. Klein subconsciously made Seigneur cast his gaze over, and he saw that at her collarbone underneath the tear, there was a deep wound that exposed her bone amidst fair, supple skin. At this moment, the skin transformed, producing dense patterns of mystery and colors of darkness and evil. Klein's mind seemed to explode as ravings and cries resounded in it. Meanwhile, his breathing became difficult as his body rapidly weakened. He couldn't help but collapse backward as he broke into a coughing fit. Then, he saw the pure white robe and the two long female legs, Panatia. This lady had already entered the grayish-white mill, and as she watched the struggling German sparrow, she cracked the corners of her lips and revealed blood-colored tendrils in the gaps between her neat, white teeth. She softly said, "Got you." Chapter 834, Good Luck, Got You. Invisible threads emanated over as Panatia said that. They quickly wrapped around German Sparrow as though she was binding him into a cocoon. At this moment, the figure in a black clergyman robe suddenly turned thin, transforming into a paper figurine covered in metal rust. Klein's figure appeared outside the grayish-white mill as he ran frantically towards the depths of the town. He was a person who had seen the eternal blazing sun's true body and lived. He had a certain level of resistance towards a spirit-body impact and the inclination of a loss of control brought about by a mythical creature form. Furthermore, Panatia wasn't a complete mythical creature. Therefore, even without the gray fog's help, Klein was able to recover from the racking headache. As he suppressed his body's mutation, he sensed that he had been inflicted with ailments. While collapsing, he used his violent coughing as a cover for him to use paper figurine substitutes. Paper figurines weren't mystical items, nor did they have any spirituality. Hence, Klein wasn't afraid that it would trigger a reaction from the core seal behind Cheney's gate. Hence, he had brought quite a number with him. As Klein ran forward, rubbed his right thumb and middle finger and lit up the flour piled inside the mill. Boom! The flour burst into flames as the mill was sent flying. The windmill outside collapsed to the ground as Panatia's figure crumbled bit by bit in the intense blast and scarlet flames as though she was a mirror. Almost at the same moment, her white-robed figure appeared behind Klein. Her loose, pulled-back hair instantly flared up and wildly extended in Klein's direction. Pa! As Klein snapped his fingers to ignite a tree leaf beside him, he controlled Senor to use mirror leap to appear in a window on a two-storied residence beside Panatia. Then, he attempted to make the terrifying woman's eyes reflect Senor's figure to complete the wraith possession. Scarlet flames suddenly leaped up and enveloped Klein's body, making him vanish from where he was as he appeared in a flame tens of meters away. As for Panatia's gem-like eyes, they seemed to hide mirrors that reflected figures wearing an old triangular hat and dark red coat. They overlapped one another and descended into chaos. Klein didn't hesitate to let Senor leave the window, transforming into a werewolf state to charge the demoness. Yes, Klein had already determined that Panatia was a demoness, and she was a demoness at the demigod level. The strands of black hair, as well as the invisible transparent threads, flared up, forming a ludicrous spiderweb that enveloped Senor, whose body was covered with thick, short hair. However, just as they made contact, Admiral of Blood's figure instantly phased away, causing the black hair and illusory demoness threads to pass through it. Without being able to touch him, it was obviously unable to bind him. He had taken his wraith form. Humph. Panatia's expression didn't change at all. All she did was produce a harumph. Suddenly, the thick hair strands and illusory threads that made contact with Senor burst into dark and silent black flames. They used spirituality as fuel, turning the wraith into a torch. Pa! 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 Senor turned back into a werewolf from the burning as his limbs fell to the ground from the flame injuries. With that, a sequence 5 wraith perished completely. And at this moment, Klein had repeatedly snapped his fingers, jumping into different columns of fire and using his marionette sacrifice to escape deeper into the town. With a few flashes, he had pulled open a gap of hundreds of meters from Panatia. Suddenly, Klein felt his forehead burning hot. His lungs began to heave as he panted loudly and emitted heated air. As he had been hit by the impact of seeing an incomplete mythical creature's form, he had been a little too slow at using paper figurine substitutes. He had failed to swap out his ailment, and he had suffered some of the damage. Klein had originally imagined that he just needed to persist until he escaped Panatia's range of influence, but to his surprise, his condition was worsening faster than he expected. Furthermore, despite having opened up a gap of hundreds of meters, he didn't escape the signs of being infected. Thud. Just as he was about to continue using Flaming Jump, Klein's knees buckled as he collapsed to the ground without successfully snapping his fingers. Immediately, he heard Panatia's pleasant laughter in his ears. Even if you were to escape to the other side of town, there's no way to escape my ailments. You ought to know that back in Backlund, the entirety of East Borough was immersed in the plague fog I created. Apart from the most distant Empress Borough and West Borough, all the other areas were significantly affected as well. She's that Lady Despair who cooperated with Mr. A. She's one of the true murderers behind the great smog of Backlund. Klein felt his mind go adrift as he found himself become very sick while reeling in pain and despair. Although it still wasn't lethal, the irresistible coughs prevented him from using most of his beyonder powers. Panatia walked over as her beautiful eyes were stained with an indescribable color of bloodthirst. It was like a tramp finally seeing a sizzling steak after starving for days. In her hands were what was left of Senor's torso and 2 broken limbs. This was apparently meant to be her stockpile of food. Your finger snap sounded good. I believe the taste of those 2 fingers should be pretty good. Panatia looked at Gehrman Sparrow as he coughed in the distance, speaking with the tone of a raving lunatic. Just as she finished her sentence, she raised her hand and stuffed Senor's index finger into her mouth. She bit down on each segment, producing crushing sounds. Klein watched this scene with a blurred vision. In his grogginess, he felt his fingers also suffering such excruciating pain. At this moment, he knew that Lady Despair Panatia was already partially mad because she had eaten too much flesh from other Beyonders. Although with her knowledge of mysticism, she would have definitely waited for the Beyonder characteristics to seep out before partaking in her meal, the deceased had been trapped in here without any food, making them each other's targets. It was inevitable that they slowly lost their minds as they approached insanity. How could she remain fine eating such meat? Just as Klein was reeling in despair and wondering what method he could use to save himself, he saw the crimson moonlight suddenly turn bright. He saw Panatia's face colored with a look of horror. Without hesitation, she turned around and charged into a nearby building and slammed the door. As Klein felt his illness alleviate significantly, he hurriedly looked up into the sky. He saw that the crimson moonlight was already penetrating the fog, appearing clear as it illuminated the town. His heart stirred as he recalled what Panatia had previously said. He immediately struggled and hobbled into another building beside him without forgetting to lock the door. Once the crimson moon turns clear, there will be changes here. It will become extremely dangerous. Chapter 835. The figures coming and going. After rushing into the building and closing the door, Klein realized that the curtains behind the windows were constantly in a drawn state. Only some faint crimson moonlight seeped in, lighting up the room slightly. He didn't bother making any additional observations as he found a wooden chair and sat down. He attempted to enter cogitation to calm his inclinations towards mutating. Since he had witnessed a saint-leveled Beyonder's incomplete mythical creature form, how could he survive it that easily? This wasn't the mysterious space above the gray fog that came with recovery effects. As Klein was able to withstand mental blows relatively well, he was able to straighten his thoughts out early and prevent himself from losing control, thus, allowing him to successfully escape. However, this didn't mean that the problem had been resolved. He sat there, relying on cogitation and his control over his emotions to resist the waves of insane thoughts. During this process, he heard his cheekbones produce crunching sounds. He saw his black hair turn long and thick in an uncontrollable manner as his chest bulged through his clothes while his skin produced granules in the form of meat tendrils. After nearly 30 seconds, Klein finally exhaled and relaxed significantly. He had completely recovered from the effects that Panatia's incomplete mythical creature form brought. He even gained some new knowledge. The level she was at had despair at its core, making her good at creating and spreading plagues. The insanity and mutation from witnessing a mythical creature not only produce the symptoms of losing control of one's pathway, but it also comes with the traits of the other party's sequence. Back then, I was nearly baked by the eternal blazing sun, and this time, I nearly became a demoness. Klein looked down at himself, restoring his skin, chest, and hair to normal. If he wasn't a faceless, aside from letting those meat tendrils sink into his body, he would have to rely on external forces to resolve the problem. Without the time to poignantly sigh or analyze the situation, Klein slowly stood up and cast his gaze towards the tightly drawn, dark-colored curtains as he attempted to figure out his current situation. His expression suddenly changed because he heard rowdy murmurs outside the street. At that instant, he felt that, apart from him and Lady Despair Panatia, the uninhabited town suddenly had many residents. They were loitering across the streets and alleys, greeting one another as they discussed whether to only buy bread or be extravagant and buy a pound of beef. The foggy town suddenly seemed to come to life. However, none of the figures entered the buildings that lined the streets. They seemed to keep coming and going across the street, producing voices that one would find difficult to believe to be conversations, as they sounded more like the deep growling of savage beasts. Klein couldn't imagine the scene outside. All he knew was that even a demigod-level demoness had to hide from the danger. He retracted his gaze and thought deeply for a few seconds, silently muttering, "I can't head out. But I can't stay in here either. Who knows when that crimson moon will be covered by fog again, allowing Panatia to regain her freedom of movement. When the time comes, with us being so close, there's no way for me to escape. But, how do I move without heading out?" In his silence, Klein slowly turned his body and faced the pitch-black spired cathedral. According to Lady Despair Panatia, that cathedral was the only place she didn't dare explore. It was as though entering the cathedral was the only way to escape her hunt. Of course, a demoness like Panatia wasn't necessarily speaking the truth, but Klein believed that she wasn't likely to lie regarding such matters. After all, to her, he was her prey, her delicacy. Besides, Panatia back then was using her speech and charm to entice him bit by bit, designing a trap for him so as to capture her prey. With a demigod's confidence, it was unlikely she would reveal information as a bluff. In addition, at such times, speaking the truth was the safest and most reassuring option. There was no need to worry about the prey escaping ahead of time due to the detection of a lie. Unless her half-mad state causes her to habitually lie, otherwise, it shouldn't be a problem. Klein, who was out of options, quickly made up his mind. He lowered his left hand and made creeping hunger turn transparent. Although he knew that traveling was useless, he still held out hope because this was the point when the crimson moon was at its clearest. There was no obstruction, and it was round like a silver plate. During such times, Mr. Dorr could transmit his shouts into the ears of his descendants from where he was lost. Traveling was enhanced and anomalies happened, so it wasn't something impossible. Klein's figure rapidly phased away, but seconds later, his body outline appeared again where he stood. I can't enter the spirit world, to the point of not even sensing it. As a beyonder power, traveling only has a third of its uses. It can barely be used as invisibility. Klein muttered silently as he concluded his experiences and lessons. However, he was puzzled about one point. Traveling's phasing away and turning transparent is due to the unique traits of the spirit world, so why would it be effective? Klein pondered for about 10 seconds before he came to a rough idea. Every person must be connected to the spirit world because one's astral projection is located there. It can obtain all kinds of abstract information, which is the reason why revelations can be obtained from divination. Therefore, when we are converted into a hidden and secret state, our connection with the spirit world becomes part of it. This can explain why I can still use the unique traits of the spirit world, but am unable to enter it. This is because the former had a portion of it hidden away. I didn't have the time to consider it before and had attempted flaming jump. I was met with success, and this also requires the unique traits of the spirit world. After confirming this point, Klein raised his right hand and snapped his fingers, attempting to ignite a half-melted candle in the neighboring building. He wanted to use flaming jump to pass through the neighboring buildings and slowly approach the spired cathedral. Once the crimson moon was hidden by the fog, he would reassess the situation to decide if he would take the risk and hide inside. A scarlet flame was set ablaze in the neighboring building as it slowly expanded and illuminated the surroundings. At that moment, the streets outside suddenly turned abnormally silent. All of the beast-like growls disappeared. The figures that loitered on the street seemed to turn to face the building, using their gazes in an attempt to penetrate the windows. Klein instantly broke out into a cold sweat. He didn't dare to leap over as he instinctively snapped his fingers and extinguished the flame. After a brief silence, the rowdy murmurings sounded again. The indistinct figures continued walking here and there. Only then did Klein heave a sigh of relief. He raised his hand to wipe the cold sweat from his forehead. He discovered that he had unknowingly made several mistakes after entering the foggy town. In such a dangerous and bizarre environment, he hadn't divined if he should light the candle in the neighboring building. My spiritual intuition should have warned me, but it didn't. From the looks of it, after the gray fog was screened away, my spiritual intuition and sense for danger are no longer enhanced. Now, I'm just a little stronger than a marionettist of the same level. I'm far from being crazy powerful. It's because of this that I was incited by Panatia's instigator powers to look at her wound. I didn't receive any premonition for danger and subconsciously believed that it wouldn't be a problem with a marionette in between us. Klein temporarily didn't have time to have an after-action review of his previous battle. He placed his attention back onto approaching the cathedral without heading out. He began scrutinizing himself and his mystical items beyond her powers. Suddenly, his eyes lit up as he found a solution. This solution stemmed from a traveler's door opening which he thought was useless. This beyonder power was completely overshadowed by teleportation under normal circumstances, but in this mysterious and bizarre foggy town, just its usage of the unique traits of the spirit world became more useful. Klein wasn't in a rush to take action as he took out the gold coin which Senor used to reside in. Using divination to question his spirituality, he obtained the answer that he should penetrate the wall. And without any way to obtain a revelation from the spirit world, he could only choose to trust himself. He then walked to the wall that was shared with the neighboring building and pressed his hands on it. Silently, Klein passed through the stone wall and entered the next building. He followed the terrace houses until he arrived at the final one. According to his initial impressions of the town, he was already very close to the spired cathedral. He didn't need more than 2 flaming jumps to reach it. At that moment, the crimson moonlight that penetrated the dark-colored curtains didn't weaken. He could vaguely see figures coming and going like they were leading a normal life. Without being capable of moving further away, all Klein could do was sit down on a wooden chair that was a distance away from the windows. It was almost completely dark here with deep, dark shadows. Only at this point did he had the time to recall the details of his encounter with Demoness Panatia. She's actually the murderer that caused the great smog of Backlund. Tens of thousands of people died because of her. Even more people suffered the pain of losing their loved ones. Old Kohler who worked hard to live, Mam Liz who worked hard to raise her 2 daughters. Klein closed his eyes as he lifted his head and took deep breaths. He forced himself to extricate himself from the anger and hatred that suddenly surged in him as he calmly observed the turn of events. Unfortunately, I didn't let Senor wear that flower of blood, otherwise, he should still be able to put up a struggle. However, there wasn't a choice. While possessing me, wearing a ring corresponding to a rose bishop while entering Cheney's gate would be equivalent to blasting myself apart. Now, the only mystical item I can use is creeping hunger. There's zombie, baron of corruption, desire apostle, and traveler inside. Yes, I should try to see if I can contact the gray fog by praying while the crimson moon is clear. It doesn't work. I can now confirm that even with a marionette between us, I'll still be affected by a demoness charm and incitement. Since Panatia can release a plague on a large scale, why didn't she attack me in secret in such a concealed manner? Instead, she waited until I nearly lost control from witnessing her incomplete mythical creature form and exposed my location before spreading the ailments. She can definitely do it. The great smog of Backlund is the best proof. There are 2 explanations. First, it's because I was personally sent here by the angel. This made her place a great deal of attention on me, worried that spreading the plague in advance would be detected by my spirituality. Second, she's afraid of something, so she doesn't dare to blanket the area with her plague. If it's the latter, there are other dangers here. As Klein thought over the matter, he felt his spiritual perception trigger as a chill ran down his back. Almost at the same time, he saw that a deep shadow that blanketed him and the surroundings suddenly shrank, drilling towards his nostrils, mouth, and ears. Chapter 836, Tossing Food. At that moment, the shadow seemed to turn corporeal. It was ice-cold and moist, and it instantly bound Klein within it like he was a mosquito in amber. Klein's figure was squashed and compressed as he regressed into a piece of paper, rapidly turning into mush. Paper figurine substitutes. Having sensed the danger ahead of time, he had made timely use of paper figurine substitutes. His black-robed figure appeared on the other end of the dining table as he opened his mouth, producing a bang sound. At this moment, Klein's mind suddenly turned adrift as he found his surroundings blurry and unclear. He instantly understood what was happening. He had been forcefully pulled into a dream. And with this, he determined one point: his abnormal ability of maintaining his lucidity and rationality in dreams had already solidified and become one with him. There was no need to use the gray fog to do so. After a brief struggle, Klein suddenly snapped awake and saw the shadows in the building slowly surging at him like a tidal wave. Bang! He opened his mouth and produced an extremely mighty air bullet. This bullet struck the shadow, producing a huge swath of white. The shadows around the whiteness immediately receded and filled it to the brim, returning everything to normal once again. Klein took this opportunity to roll to the side and turned his left glove pale with a tinge of dark green. With a clap, the spot he stood at was smashed by a lump of flesh and blood that flew out from the shadow, covering the dark red carpet that was covered with strange mold. In an unobvious manner, Klein had a feeling that he was being weakened. Without any time to think deeper into the matter, he immediately made his feet produce an icy layer that emanated cold air. White frost crept up and rapidly froze the shadow. Underneath the crystalline frost was a squirming and warping pitch blackness, like oil that had its own life. Zombies ice stun. Klein did another flip and changed his position while making his glove produce black granules that were profound and dark. Right on the heels of that, he straightened his body, and facing the shadow beneath the layer of ice, he said a word filled with foulness, a word that came from the devil language, slow. Suddenly, Klein saw the shadow squirming slow down. Clearly, it was in an extremely sluggish state. However, his thoughts had also turned sluggish, preventing him from dealing any follow-up attacks. His language of foulness had been distorted, and although it was clearly directed at the shadow, it had been distorted to target the entire living room, hence, affecting himself. In just seconds, Klein extricated himself from the slowed state, and without any thought, he lunged for the dining table, picking up a plate with half a piece of steak and throwing it at the shadow. During this process, his left glove remained dark black, but it had a sinister and noble vibe. Bribe. He had used the steak to bribe the enemy, weakening the other party's offensive, defensive, and controlling abilities. At this moment, the figure suddenly shrank back into the corner of the wall, allowing the dining plate to smash and shatter into the melting ice. Then, the figure surged upwards, taking the form of a pitch-black figure with a hooded robe. In the palm of the figure, a transparent and blurry book appeared in front of him. It was accompanied by a distant and indistinct chant, "I came, I saw, I record." Just as the chanting sounded, the book rapidly flipped through the pages and produced a burning white spear. Mr. A? Has he gone completely mad? He dares to use fire-related beyonder powers in such an environment? Klein's heart tightened as his thoughts raced. He hurriedly rushed towards his opponent and held his left hand behind him. Creeping hunger was quickly tainted with the dark colors of corruption before condensing a ridiculous great sword that seemed to be combined from scarlet magma and blue-hot flames. Thump. Klein's footsteps were heavy as he bent his back, pulling his shoulder back as he forcefully delivered a strike with his left arm. The muscles on his arm bulged as he swung the sword of lava. Pfft. The resplendent great sword cleaved down on the fiery spear, sending sparks of white, blue, and red scattering in every direction as they ignited the chairs and curtains. The murmurs outside the street had long vanished. All the indistinct figures had turned over and there was extreme silence. After shattering the fiery spear with a cleave, Klein bent his knee and genuflected, snapping his fingers with his right hand. Pa! The flames in the entire room were extinguished. Klein didn't move any further. He had a nagging feeling that a dense array of gazes were trying to see through the curtains to seek out any abnormalities. The hooded man formed of shadows didn't take any action as well. Although he was acting crazy just moments ago, he seemed to have sensed the inexplicable horror that was slowly approaching. In the dark room with tiny hints of crimson moonlight, Klein was genuflecting while the other was standing close to the wall. It was as though the two of them had turned into stone statues. In the unbearable silence, time passed by abnormally slowly. All Klein did was count 10 seconds, and it felt like an hour had passed. Finally, the beast-like growl sounded once again in a staccato, disjointed manner, and the indistinct figures outside began walking again, returning back to the streets. Almost at the same time, Klein obtained initial control of his target's spirit-body threads. The hooded man's actions of pouncing forward instantly turned sluggish. Without any hesitation, Klein bent his body and circled the area, preparing to take advantage of his opponent's delay to disrupt any of his subsequent counterattacks and slowly turn him into a marionette. At this moment, his nose suddenly felt an itch as he couldn't help but open his mouth. Achoo! Klein sneezed and lost his control over the spirit-body threads. Furthermore, his throat began to hurt as mucus began to take form. He had caught a cold. He actually caught a cold in the intense battle. After suspecting that his opponent was Mr. A, Klein had actually been wary against a demoness ailment based on his past experience when fighting Mr. A. He had been placed at a significant disadvantage back then, but in a battle that didn't give him time to think, he had made a mistake. His constitution had long weakened due to the plague from the actual demoness, Panatia. He had no way to wait until the marionette conversion completed. He didn't even have a chance of obtaining a deeper level of initial control and use air bullets to deal a lethal strike. Achoo! As Klein sneezed, he rolled away. Meanwhile, he switched creeping hunger to the Baron of Corruption state and attempted to use his distortion powers to reduce the effects of his cold. Of course, thanks to his bribe from before, his condition wasn't too serious. All it did was affect his control over the spirit-body threads, and not make him incapable of fighting. While rolling away, Klein noticed from the corner of his eye that his opponent was leaving his shadowy state. The hood slipped backward, revealing a face that looked beautiful like a female. It was none other than Mr. A. This Aurora Order Oracle had actually managed to survive this long despite the harsh environment. However, his eyes were already bloodshot. He looked at Klein as though he was looking at a delightful delicacy. The hunger that was innate and instinctive wasn't concealed at all. At that moment, Klein's mood didn't wane because he still had sufficient strength to do battle. What he was most worried about wasn't Mr. A, but that their escalating battle would produce flames and attract the danger outside. When that happens, there was no way the two of them could escape death. Hunger. The immense hunger has made Mr. A lose his rationality and no longer care about the loitering figures. If I can slightly alleviate his hunger, he should stop attacking and patiently wait until the crimson moon is once again hidden by the fog. Give him some food? As his thoughts raced, Klein nearly sliced off a piece of his flesh to throw at Mr. A. Thankfully, he thought of something in the nick of time. He had food on him. They were the dried mushrooms that Frank Lee had produced. It was said to be a crossbreed between beef and the flesh of a rose bishop. As long as there was fish and water, it could keep reproducing. As this was a new species in a subtle sense, making it not directly related to a rose bishop, Klein had placed it with herbal powders he often used like slumber flower, without removing them. He wasn't afraid that it would trigger any anomalies within the core seal behind Cheney's gate. Achoo! With another sneeze and another roll, Klein had taken out the dried mushroom and thrown it at Mr. A. Perhaps the smell of beef had attracted him, or perhaps it was the mutual sense shared between rose bishops. Mr. A immediately stopped attempting to flip through his illusory book. As he caught the mushroom, he stuffed it into his mouth, chewed, and swallowed it. The hunger pangs that were written in his eyes gradually lessened, but the way he looked at Klein remained the same. Klein threw the remaining dried mushrooms at Mr. A, who caught them. Without any hesitation, he cleanly ate them. His vision finally turned for the better. Glancing at the indistinct figures loitering outside the windows, he stepped back into a corner, fusing into the shadows. Phew. Klein heaved a sigh of relief and retreated to another corner of the wall. Mr. A actually isn't dead. I have to say that in such an environment, a rose bishop's abilities can provide immense help. Just using the stored flesh and eating himself can make him last quite long. Of course, the fact that Mr. A hasn't been killed by Lady Despair Panatia implies his strength. However, the demigod-level powers he recorded must have been used up. As Klein thought, he deliberated over his words, wishing to sound out Mr. A for more information. Have you found any clues on how to leave? There was silence as Mr. A didn't give an answer. His insanity has made it impossible to talk to him? Klein pondered for 2 seconds and said a name, Leomaster. This was the name of the Aurora Order Saint of Darkness who had dissociated personalities. After a brief silence, Mr. A's slightly hoarse voice sounded again. He has been sent in here as well? Indeed, only matters regarding the Aurora Order elicits a response. Klein frankly said, no, he is trapped inside the ruins of the Battle of Gods. Without waiting for Mr. A to say a word, he continued, why don't you enter the cathedral? Mr. A said in a muddled manner, it's very dangerous, very, very dangerous. It's also dangerous outside. All the dangers stem from there. All the people who vanished would reappear during the crimson moon. Before he could finish his sentence, the tiny bit of crimson moonlight that passed through the curtains suddenly turned extremely dim. Chapter 837, The Hangers. As the crimson moonlight dimmed, a thought surfaced in Klein's mind. The crimson moon is about to be covered by fog again. Just as this thought appeared, the indistinct, loitering figures outside vanished as though they had evaporated into thin air. The beast-like growls also came to a halt. The environment has been restored to its previous state. Demoness of Despair Panatia can move about freely again. Mr. A will no longer have any qualms about the danger outside. He can unleash a barrage of attacks to capture his prey. Klein instantly came to a conclusion as he raised his right index finger and snapped, igniting the leaves of a tree tens of meters away. He wanted to open up a gap with Mr. A to prevent himself from getting sicker. At the same time, he wanted to determine if he should take the risk of entering the ancient cathedral. With respect to his present situation, Klein already had a plan in mind. It was to use Mr. A's potent and multifarious abilities to draw Panatia's attention. After all, to her, a shepherd and a marionettist weren't any different when it came to meat quality. They could both fill her stomach, so her priority was definitely on who was easier to deal with. When the time comes, both parties would definitely engage in a battle, and Klein needed to find an opportunity to strike down Panatia. Just as the scarlet flame soared and engulfed Klein, he saw Mr. A turn into a shadow and meld into the surroundings once again. It was unknown where he hid himself. He ran. Aren't you the crazy Mr. A? Shouldn't you continue pursuing your prey? Why did you run? Klein's gaze froze as he couldn't help but twitch the corners of his mouth. His figure vanished amidst the flames before appearing in flames tens of meters away. Just as Klein leaped out of the fire, he felt his forehead burning once again. His lungs felt heavy as his breathing became rapid and difficult. Plague. Demoness of Despair Panatia had spread her plague once again. To Klein, this beautiful lady in a pure white robe had already floated somewhere in midair at some point in time, walking towards him. Beneath her feet were countless transparent and thin lines that formed a spider's web. They were connected to the surrounding buildings and trees, fully covering half the street. In the eyes of this demigod-level demoness, the intense hunger pangs were gone. The obvious bloodshot look in her eyes wasn't there, and the way she looked at Gehrman Sparrow was one of insanity and teasing. It was as though she wanted to drain his ability to resist, bit by bit, making him feel the deepest, most heavy, and most painful despair. Klein held back his urge to cough as he snapped his fingers again, causing the tree beside the cathedral to burst into flames. His figure was immediately engulfed by the fire as he rapidly faded away and appeared above the tree. He had appeared amidst the gorgeous flames. Right on the heels of that, Klein hurriedly jumped to the ground, somersaulting to the side of the ancient cathedral. At this moment, his body suddenly turned cold as he found that his feet, thighs, and waist were covered in thick layers of ice. And surrounding him was an accumulation of frost as the temperature declined rapidly. Klein clenched his teeth, holding back the horror within him. He followed his plan, and he reached out his arms in an abnormally rigid fashion, pressing it straight onto the wall. The creeping hunger on his left hand turned transparent. In silence, Klein passed through the thick, pitch-black wall and entered the spired cathedral. The spot where he was standing had a black fireball smash into the wall, just a little too slow. It splashed out like water, burning away the nearby frost and weeds. At this moment, at the top of the ancient cathedral spire, swirling ravens opened their beaks. Wah! 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 Panatia halted as she looked at the dark cathedral. Bit by bit, her face was dyed with a look of fear. Inside the cathedral, Klein found himself unable to see anything, as it was darker than the outside. As the frost melted, and with him getting accustomed to the dim lights, he finally saw the scene before him. As far as he could see, there were figures being hung up in midair. They were all humans. Some of them were dressed in black classical robes, others in brown jackets. Some were wearing very fluffy skirts, while others had tattered clothes, making them resemble beggars. Some of them had boorish looks, others handsome with cut facial features. Some of them were beautiful, others tender, adorable, and looking youthful. None of them looked the same. No, there was something that they had in common. They were like meat that was undergoing a curing process. They hung from above, swaying gently as their heads were bowed and their eyes rolled back. Klein felt his scalp tingle as he no longer doubted that this place was extremely dangerous as described by Panatia and Mr. A. He held his back to the wall, planning on using door opening to leave to avoid danger the moment anything happened. He would then pass through the wall if he was discovered by the Demoness of Despair to avoid her attacks. By repeatedly doing so, he could ensure his safety. Whoosh! A cold air blew through the cathedral as the figures and corpses turned around, facing Klein. Their collars were like ropes that left their heads drooping. Klein nearly drew a gasp as he pressed his left palm onto the wall. At this moment, the figures began to sway like wind chimes. They opened their eyes and produced raving-like voices, Hornacis. Phlegria. Hornacis. Phlegria. Hornacis. Phlegria. The voices resounded into one, drilling into Klein's ears as he found it abnormally familiar. This was the raving that he had heard during his advancements in the past. It actually originated from here, from the foggy town. It came from the corpses that hung high in this ancient cathedral. At that instant, not only was Klein's scalp tingling, he even felt his body trembling. Could it be that this foggy town actually originates from the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range? That nation of the Evernight which vanished? Don't tell me that I really am on the mountain. However, why would it be inside this cathedral? These same ravings don't bring about a headache or push me towards losing control. Klein hissed as he spread his hands and clenched it again repeatedly, resisting the urge to pass through the wall. Since he was already inside and had seen the source of the ravings, he believed that escaping probably didn't resolve any problems. Regardless, it's necessary to do a simple search. Otherwise, I wouldn't even know the reason when something abnormal happens to me. After using a gold coin to quickly do a divination, Klein tapped his molars gently and activated his spirit vision. He looked up at the hanging figures and found their spirituality converged. The aura colors looked normal, but they exuded a stiff appearance. There are aura colors. They aren't dead yet? Klein frowned slightly and deactivated his spirit vision. Right on the heels of that, he tapped his left thumb on the first segment of his index finger, planning to observe the spirit body threads. Upon sweeping his gaze across, Klein's pupils dilated because the spirit body threads of the swaying figures looked extremely special. The illusory black threads that corresponded to their bodies were extended in the same direction, the peak of the ancient cathedral. There wasn't a single exception. In Klein's vision, they were like corpses being hung up by their spirit body threads. Before Klein could figure out what all of this meant, he caught a scene from the corner of his eye. His spirit body threads were automatically reaching upwards to the peak of the cathedral, to the source that hung up those figures. This was the first time Klein saw spirit body threads moving autonomously. It was as though they were metals that had come into contact with magnets. They floated upwards uncontrollably, and the fastest thread had already reached its destination. Klein didn't dare imagine the outcome if all his spirit body threads gathered up above. He suspected that he too would become a piece of cured meat that would be hung up to be dehydrated, producing the ravings of Hornacis. Phlegria, along with the wind. For most Beyonders, they could only consider leaving the cathedral in a bid to sever the process of having their spirit body threads attracted, but Klein was different. He was a marionettist. Quickly, he controlled his spirit body threads and pulled them thread by thread. After nearly 30 seconds, Klein finally completed this task. However, his spirit body threads continued floating upwards. He had to constantly pay attention and resist this upward drift. This is one of the dangers lurking inside the cathedral. Klein slowly drew a breath as he no longer leaned close to the walls. Step by step, he ventured deep into the cathedral. Above him, the figures swayed as though they were watching him. After proceeding nearly 30 meters, Klein finally saw something different. It was the pitch-black altar of the cathedral. On the altar was a stone statue. Klein identified the statue when he took a few more steps. It was in the shape of a female human. However, her hips and ribs had two beast legs growing out from each one of them. These limbs were covered in short, thick, and firm black fur. In addition, the statue was surrounded with black bands that seemed to reach out like tentacles. At the statue's feet, there were souls sleeping as though they were holding her up on a pedestal. Klein shifted his gaze and looked at the statue's head and saw a beautiful face. This. Klein's gaze froze. That face wasn't unfamiliar to him, because he had been sent in here by that entity. This stone statue's appearance was identical to the eraser angel under St. Samuel Cathedral. She is actually related to this place. That's right. The people she erased are sent here, so it would be odd if she's not connected to this place. What's the connection between her and the fourth epoch's nation of the Evernight on the Hornacis mountain range? That mother of the sky? But if that's the case, why would she be working for the church? Furthermore, such an image does have its resemblance to the demonic wolf that little son mentioned. Many thoughts instantly surfaced in Klein's mind. During this process, he slowly shifted his gaze away in another direction, in the hopes of finding any possible clues. A few seconds later, Klein discovered a figure. It wasn't hung in midair but was seated diagonally behind the statue. Chapter 838, Seen from the historical void. The figure sitting diagonally behind the statue was an elder in a black robe. He wore a hood and his head was bowed with his eyes closed. By his mouth was a thick, long, and white beard. It was as though he hadn't had it trimmed for years, preventing anyone from telling what he originally looked like. And in Klein's eyes, this hoary elder was even more bizarre than the figures hanging in midair. After his spirit body threads extended out from his body, it didn't drift up to the spot which seemed to hide magnets. Instead, they coiled around his body and back on themselves, making the source and destination one and the same. Ordinary spirit body threads stemmed from inside a spirit body, extended outwards in different directions into infinity. As for the figures that hung from above, the sources of their spirit body threads was no different. The destination which they extended out to was gathered at the top of the cathedral, thus, it was obvious that there was something wrong about it. This is the reason why he hasn't been hung up. Or should I say, this is how he avoids the danger inside the cathedral. As Klein controlled his spirit body threads to resist the continuous upward drift, he silently muttered and guessed at the reason. Suddenly, he saw a pair of eyes, a pair of pitch-black eyes that looked like an unlit water surface. The elder sitting behind the statue opened his eyes. He was still alive. Klein subconsciously took a step back as he bent his back slightly, holding out his left palm in front of him. Amidst indescribable silence and anxiety, he saw the hoary elder's eyes move slightly, open his mouth slightly, and speak in a muffled manner. Finally, another seer has come here. Another? Beyonders from the seer pathway have entered this cathedral? That's right, apart from eraser angels' erasing of people, sending them to this foggy town, and those who vanished in the night at the Battle of God ruins would also appear here. Amongst them, there might be a few seer pathway beyonders who attempted to seek out mermaids in those waters, or had successfully advanced and were looking to leave. Seeing that the other party had no intention of immediately attacking him and had the intention to converse with him, he forcefully composed himself and said after some thought, "Why do you say that?" The hooded elder with black eyes and white beard didn't immediately reply as he asked with a muffled voice, "Do you wish to escape?" "I can tell you how." Klein wasn't moved as he immediately asked, "Then why are you still here?" Since the method to escaping this foggy town was known, why would one stay inside such a dangerous cathedral? The elder drooped his head and chuckled in a throaty manner. It's because I've died long ago. The hair on Klein's back stood on end as he broke out into a cold sweat. He was speechless. He could tell that the elder wasn't an existence in the form of a soul. Seeing no response, the elder slowly lifted his head and swept his glance at Klein in his Gehrman Sparrow appearance. I've used special Beyonder powers to seek out the void in this world's history and fate. I sliced off a portion of my projection and left it here. It has been maintained to this day. As for my body and my spirit, they have long died and dissipated. This is such a fascinating power. Klein was unable to verify the claim, so all he could do was ask, then why are you giving guidance on how to escape to seers who enter? The elder's voice remained muffled. After you open the door, the history and fate in here will experience a change. The projection I sliced will also vanish, and when the time comes, you will see an urn of ashes. I only wish that they could be scattered in the Srenzo River near Intis's capital, Trier. That is my hometown, the place where I was born. Do you know the place I'm referring to? I've no idea how much time has passed in the real world. He's been imprisoned for at least a century. Klein frankly replied, they still exist. Excellent, the elder said with a nod, his throat apparently filled with phlegm. Although Klein didn't fully trust the person before him, he believed that knowing more made it beneficial for him to make a judgment. Hence, he decided not to waste any time, for fear of being interrupted again. Then, how should I escape? The elder remained sitting in his spot and said without any obvious movement, see that wall behind the statue? Do you see an inset? Klein actually didn't wish to follow his instructions. After all, he had been led by Panatia to do so, resulting in him seeing her incomplete mythical creature form and, hence, suffered from shock and damage. However, he had previously planned on surveying the surroundings in search of clues. Therefore, he ultimately carefully shifted his gaze to look at the wall behind the statue. Engraved on it were short and ancient symbols, but there was an empty spot in the middle, preventing it from being connected as one. The blank area was the size of 2 palms and was obviously indented. It was as though someone had dug away a brick on its surface. As long as you find the corresponding obsidian rock and insert it, this wall will tentatively be released from a concealed and secret state. It will showcase illusory colors. When the time comes, I'll tell you of a complicated special symbol. It will be the key to opening the door on the wall, allowing you to escape. The elder didn't turn his head as he looked straight ahead and spoke in detail. A complicated special symbol. A key to opening the door. Klein listened to the ravings of Hornaces. Phlegria resound with the wind behind him as a symbol suddenly came to mind. It was the vertical I formed from many secret symbols. It was the information that the Antigonus family's notebook had passed to him by corrupting the misfortune cloth puppet. And the Antigonus family appeared to have a deep connection with the nation of the Evernight on the main peak of the Hornaces mountain range. Could this be the so-called key? Klein retracted his gaze in a calm manner as he asked, why did all the seers from before fail? The elder chuckled and said, some of them are as naggy as you are, failing to leave this cathedral before the crimson moon turned clear. They ended up being hung up. It's the case for that fellow who gave himself a handsome face. Likewise for the lady with flawless features. Klein was nearly rendered speechless by the elder's jibe. However, he also learned something. The danger inside the cathedral would greatly increase once the crimson moon turned clear. Even marionettists were unable to control their spirit-body threads. I'll have to constantly take note of the changes in light. Once the crimson moon turns clear, I'll pass through the wall. Klein looked around him and confirmed that the wall closest to the pitch-black altar was 6 to 7 meters away. Then, he quickly came up with an emergency plan. The hooded elder didn't look at him as he continued, the rest weren't very lucky. They encountered enemies that had lost their reasoning and only wanted them for food. They were then devoured. You have to know that there aren't many Beyonders from the seer pathway to begin with. The ones that can become marionettists are even fewer. The number that can come in here due to various reasons are only a handful. Of course, there are a lot more that were attracted and enticed in here, but it was difficult for them to come all the way here as they... He didn't finish his sentence as he slowly looked up and glanced at the top of the ancient cathedral. He then said with a muffled voice, "Their outcomes were equally tragic." "What do you mean?" "If I didn't attempt to steal the notebook, I would have to rely on the ravings from these hanging corpses inside this cathedral and climb up the main peak of the Hornaces mountain range to seek out the Antigonus family's treasure. Will I be considered as one of those that got attracted or enticed? It's difficult to come in here, and the outcome would be equally tragic." Klein's mind stirred as he began suspecting that the so-called treasure of the Antigonus family was nothing but a trap based on the dilapidated palace and translucent worms he had previously seen from his divinations. He didn't bother asking in more detail as he tried to sound out more important information. "Do you know where that obsidian rock is?" The elder chuckled. "It's in the hands of that demoness of despair." Demoness of despair. So Panatia really is a demoness of despair. Klein had previously addressed Panatia inwardly as such, but that was because he knew that she was called Lady Despair, as well as him being certain that she was a demoness. Hence, he had simplified the two tidbits of information and given her such a nickname. He never expected that the sequence 4 of the demoness pathway was demoness of despair. "That will be very difficult for me to obtain that obsidian rock. She's a true demigod." Klein didn't conceal the difficult position he was placed in as he waited to see if the elder had any suggestions. The elder shook his head and said, "I'm a person who is long dead. There's very little help I can provide." Didn't you have a marionette when you came in?" "Yes, but it has already been eaten by the demoness of despair," Klein replied in a seemingly calm manner. The elder sighed and chuckled. "I can help you summon him from the history of this world." Just as he said that, Klein saw lines quickly outline themselves beside him, drawing out Admiral of Blood Seigneur in his triangular hat and dark red coat. Furthermore, the spirit body threads were still under his control. Klein's pupils immediately constricted as he heard the hooded elder add, "It can only be maintained for 30 minutes. Make good use of the time. I'll help you strengthen some of the connections, enhancing your control of the marionette. This way, you can let the marionette use your Beyonder powers, and also allow you to swap locations with him instantaneously. The controllable distance and traits of him looking alive will also be boosted. Allow my marionette to use my Beyonder powers? Doesn't this mean that I can use the powers of a faceless to make my marionette turn into another me? A perfect body double? This is a demigod of the seer pathway. This is one of the powers of a Bizarro sorcerer. The enemy never knows if the one killed is the real Bizarro sorcerer. Also, summoning a marionette from history. This is completely inconceivable." Thoughts surfaced in Klein's mind as he could hardly compose himself. The elder looked up and glanced at him before continuing, "Give me a paper figurine." Klein frowned slightly and hesitated for a few seconds before taking out a paper figurine and handing it over. The elder reached out his wrinkled hand and took the paper figurine before swiping across it casually. Klein's headache, fever, and enlarged tonsils suddenly disappeared. The paper figurine was tainted with spots of red rust as it quickly cracked after becoming brittle. Using my paper figurine to transfer my ailment? Klein thought and finally asked, "Sorry for my breach of etiquette. How may I address you?" The elder didn't immediately reply as he said with a sigh, "I can only provide you a little help." He paused as he gave a muffled laugh. "You can call me, Zeradol." Chapter 839, Descendant of an Ancient God Fuck. At that instant, Klein, who heard the elder's reply, had vulgarities resound in his mind. Apart from that, no other thoughts appeared. Zeradol, the leader of the Secret Order, a descendant of the Fourth Epoch Solomon Empire aristocracy, the former owner of the Antigonus family's notebook, and the Beyonder guide for Emperor Roselle. He was a true high-sequence Beyonder of the Seer pathway, a miracle invoker who was a secret existence about 2 centuries ago. He was believed by Rhodes to have lost control, turning from an angel into a monster during his attempt to advance to Sequence 1, Attendant of Mysteries. No matter which description was used, he was a heavyweight that the present Klein was unable to resist. He had the feeling of shock that a figure from history textbooks had jumped out of it and walked in front of him, alive. He also felt the air around him appear to congeal as they piled on top of him, crushing his body and stifling his breathing. Klein had once imagined that perhaps all his encounters, including his transmigration, had stemmed from Zeradol's setup, and he suspected that he would be akin to the final boss he would encounter in games. And now, he had met him, ahead of time. I'm only a sequence 5. Klein couldn't help but shout out inwardly as he suspected if the person opposite him was the real Zeradol. Zeradol is a last name. It represents an aristocratic family in the 4th epoch Solomon Empire. In theory, there should be many Zeradols over 2,000 years of history. Perhaps the one in Roselle's diary is the grandfather, father, brother, or son of that secret order's leader. Also, he mentioned that he has been dead for years, while Rhodes and Will Septon have testified that the secret order's leader, Zeradol, is still alive. He has just lost control and turned into a monster, turning extremely crazy. Klein tried to convince himself that the situation might not be as terrible as he imagined. This quickly calmed him down as he began to carefully contemplate. The beyonder powers that this Zeradol showcased doesn't seem like much, but all of them exceed the realm of normalcy. It's even more so for those that's related to history and fate. He's definitely not only a bizarro sorcerer. He might even be a sequence 3 or sequence 2. And this pathway's angels are few to begin with. This place is intricately tied with the nation of the Evernight, which disappeared from the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range, and it produces the ravings that reach the ears of low and mid-sequence beyonders of the seer pathway. Back then, the secret order's leader, Zeradol, had fewer appearances after he obtained the Antigonus family's notebook via Emperor Roselle. It's unknown what he was plotting. Does this mean that I can believe he had come to the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range to seek out the treasure left behind by the Antigonus family based on the notebook and obtained the corresponding potion formula and ingredients of sequence 1 attendant of mysteries? In the world of mysticism, repeated coincidences usually imply problems and a confirmation. If it is that Zeradol, could it be that splitting himself to store himself inside the foggy town is the reason that caused his ultimate loss of control? As for being long dead, there's an even more reasonable explanation. The secret order leader, Zeradol, had said so himself. What is a miracle? A miracle is to be resurrected from the dead. And he was already a miracle invoker. As Klein's mind churned, the hoary elder who claimed to be Zeradol chuckled. From your reaction, you seem to know me? Klein quickly probed. I've heard of this last name. I once met Queen Mystic and learned of the secret order from her, and also know of its leader. The elder nodded gently without giving any confirmation or denial. He smiled and vaguely asked, what other help do you need? Help. Klein recalled the beyonder powers he had showcased and said after some hesitation, are you able to summon a fish from the outside world from this concealed world's history? It's okay if it has already been turned into food. From his point of view, it wasn't an impossibility. After all, most people that entered the town had come from Sonia C's easternmost front, the ruins of the Battle of Gods. Perhaps some fish that had been reared there had been brought in. They could be used to be stored as food and also used to observe the changes in the environment. There could also be explorers who vanished from not being able to sleep in time when night came after eating their fill of fish. It wasn't unreasonable that fish meat could be found in the history of the foggy town. Zeradol raised his head and looked at Klein. He didn't immediately give him an answer. After a few seconds, he leveled his gaze and said indistinctly, yes. Just as he said that, a blob made up of ground fish meat appeared in Admiral of Blood Seigneur's hands. It can only be maintained for 45 minutes. Once it's over, it's as though one has never eaten it before, Zeradol added. That actually worked. Klein increasingly found the high-sequence beyonder powers of the seer pathway to really be bizarre and terrifying. He had planned on saying that he didn't need any help, but considering how Zeradol was well known to be deceitful, with everything he said and did being questionable, he felt that he needed to make some preparations. Amidst his thoughts, Klein decided to appear a little greedy to lower Zeradol's appraisal of him and believe that he could easily lead him to do his bidding. After letting his marionette put away the fish meat, his eyes rolled a little as he indiscernibly drew a breath and said, "I still need the Bizarro Sorcerer Potion formula." Zeradol didn't change his posture as he fell silent for a few seconds. He then said with a chuckle, "No problem. As long as you trust that I'll give you a real formula. After you return with the obsidian rock, I'll hand over both the Bizarro Sorcerer Potion formula and the symbol needed for opening the door to you." Sigh, that isn't something that I need to care about. All that matters is that you scatter my ashes back into the river in my hometown. After Klein listened in silence, he couldn't help but ask, "You have a very high level. The ashes you leave behind will contaminate the river and create countless monsters." Zeradol laughed upon hearing that. "Very meticulous. However, there's nothing special about my ashes. I've lost them long ago." As he spoke, he looked up again and glanced at the peak of the ancient cathedral. He's hinting that his Beyonder characteristics and body's specialness had been absorbed by the magnet above? Klein pondered over Zeradol's meaning as he pressed on matters regarding his Beyonder pathway. "What's the sequence 3 potion name after Bizarro Sorcerer?" Zeradol's beard moved slightly as he said, "Scholar of Yore." Scholar of Yore. Although it sounds like a relic that's already dead and dug out from a tome, Zeradol has repeatedly mentioned history. The corresponding Beyonder powers are fascinating. Klein thought in glee as he asked again, "Then what's the corresponding sequence 0? Zeradol lifted his head again and glanced at him. Finally, he chuckled and said, "You will likely know when you open the door to escape." "I hate people like you, saying things midway, often just smiling without giving an answer." Klein immediately understood the feeling Emperor Roselle once had as he turned his gaze to the statue beside him and asked, "Who is this?" Zeradol's head didn't turn as he said in a muffled manner, "She is a descendant of an ancient god." A descendant of an ancient god. A descendant of annihilation demonic wolf Flegria. This ancient god seems to wield the authority of Evernight. His descendant established the nation of the Evernight? Before Klein could ask a question, he heard Zeradol chuckle and say, "She also has a brother that you wouldn't be unfamiliar with." "Who is it?" Klein tried hard to recall who, but he couldn't find an answer. Zeradol chuckled. He gave himself a new last name. Antigonus. Antigonus. Nation of the Evernight. Hornacis. Flegria. Klein's eyes lit up slightly as he pieced together the fragmented pieces of information. It's very easy to understand the Church of Evernight destroying the nation of the Evernight, as it's a battle of authorities. However, to completely eradicate the Antigonus family for having inherited the seer Beyonder paths of the divine doesn't make sense. There's no need to go that far. After all, the pathways that can be interchanged with the sleepless pathway are the death and giant pathways. Furthermore, Klein was still puzzled to this day. Why would the Antigonus family place their treasure on the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range? Why did they trust the people of the nation of the Evernight that much? Now, he finally understood something. Just as Klein was about to ask more questions, he suddenly saw the crimson moonlight shining in from the cathedral's windows brighten. It drew out shadows of the corpses hanging in midair. The crimson moon has turned clear. Klein's heart tightened. Without any additional thoughts, he followed his emergency plans by raising his right hand. Snapping his fingers, he lit a candle by the wall that was a distance away from him. At the same time, he got Seigneur to possess him as he leaped out, somersaulting in the process before arriving at the wall closest to the outside. And this time, the entire cathedral had turned abnormally silent. There were no longer any resounding ravings. Klein's spiritual intuition didn't give him any indication of danger, but he could tell from the shadows on the ground that the corpses hanging in midair had turned towards the flame. Without any hesitation, Klein pressed his left palm down, passing through a wall and arriving outside the cathedral. Then, without even daring to even raise his head, he borrowed the driving force of a wraith to tumble and run towards the nearest building. The distance from wall to wall was only about 10 meters. During this process, he didn't hear the beast-like growls nor detect the loitering figures. However, his back felt like it was being pierced by a sea of glares. In just a second, Klein had appeared outside the building. Pressing down with his palms, he passed through the wall. Then, he snapped his fingers and remotely used flame controlling to ignite a candle inside the cathedral. After a brief moment of silence and anxiety, the feeling of being stared at vanished. Beyond the tightly drawn curtains, figures began to appear as they began loitering. Chapter 840. Using his advantage with all the abnormalities vanishing, Klein heaved a slight sigh of relief. He began to observe his surroundings. Then, he selected a shadowy spot that wasn't too dark due to the faint moonlight. This was to prevent himself from suffering any sudden attacks. And the few seconds from before had made him come up with a theory about the faint figures and beast-like growls. They were previously corpses that were hung inside the cathedral, producing the ravings of Hornaces. Phlegria. When Klein passed through the wall and left the cathedral, the corpses that hung from above had turned to face the lit candle, and there weren't any figures on the street until Klein remotely used flame controlling and extinguished the flame. Everything was the same as before. When the crimson moon is clear and one's spirituality is enhanced, the magnet at the top of the cathedral will have a stronger influence on the foggy town. It will be able to control those corpses to loiter around and pretend that everything is normal. If that really is the case, the light might actually be attracting the controller's attention. Under such circumstances, if the flame isn't extinguished and the source is locked on, it might result in an extremely terrifying outcome. I can't rely on flame controlling to repeatedly divert the attention of those figures, Klein reminded himself. Then, he turned to use his spirit body thread's vision that he didn't deactivate, to size up the bread, stewed beef potatoes, and red wine on the dining table. He suspected that the food here was part of the magnet at the top of the cathedral. If it was consumed, one's spirit body threads would be corrupted, and it would cause them to be unable to resist floating towards the cathedral. This also explained why eating the food caused them to vanish. They ended up being hung up to dry in the cathedral and be let out to walk when the crimson moon turned clear. This matched Mr. A's description of the vanished people's reappearance under the bright moonlight. At a glance, Klein discovered that the food was like living beings. They had spirit body threads extending out, reaching towards the ancient cathedral. The most special point about them was that they had only one spirit body thread, obviously being different from the dense, countless spirit body threads of a normal living creature. Indeed, it's close to my theory. After obtaining some validation regarding his theory, Klein retracted his gaze and considered how to deal with Demoness of Despair Panatia. Beside him, Wraith Senior in his ancient triangular hat and dark red robe appeared. This marionette's bones cracked as his face squirmed. Soon, he turned into Gehrman Sparrow. This was a marionette using the powers of a faceless. Klein observed his double for a moment and realized that there were some flaws. The clothes couldn't be changed, and if he concealed them with an illusion, it wasn't possible for him to fool a demigod-level Demoness of Despair. Even Mr. A might not fall for it. After some thought, he made Wraith Senior take off his clothes. As for himself, he took off the black clergyman robe, and they switched clothes with one another. While wearing the clothes and hat, Klein's expression turned odd. Over the past 2 months, the marionette had been wearing the same outfit. It had been down the sewers and experienced an explosion, so there were all sorts of smells mixed into the clothes. It wasn't a pleasant smell. Sigh, my present suffering is all a result of my laziness prior to this. Klein sighed silently as he completed changing his appearance. He had turned into Gehrman Sparrow dressed as a pirate captain. At this moment, Senior had also changed into the black clergyman robe. His aura was spirited and no longer cold. He looked no different from a living person. Klein deliberated for a moment and took off Creeping Hunger, allowing Admiral of Blood to wear it on his left hand. This way, the marionette was the perfect copy of Gehrman Sparrow. One must go all the way when putting on an act. Besides, if Creeping Hunger were to revolt at this moment, then it will be eating the marionette. Once the marionette lapses, will it feel cheated? It's like it ate a placebo. As Klein got Senor to get used to his state and take away the fish meat, he seriously began formulating plans. Relying on a marionette that can use my beyonder powers wouldn't be able to defeat a demoness of despair. Even stealing the obsidian rock from her is nearly impossible. She's a genuine demigod after all. Even though this extremely convincing marionette gives me a chance of achieving success in battle, such as letting it draw her attention while I complete a sudden sneak attack and constantly swap positions, thus confusing Panatia so that she can't make an accurate judgment, I can't make up for the disadvantage that stems from the difference in our levels and strength to achieve my goals. I can consider using the marionette to engage in close combat and attempt to control Panatia's spirit body threads. He's already a corpse, so he wouldn't be affected by the plague. I can catch her by surprise using this method. But there are too many problems. First, the mysticism, viruses, and germs that a demoness of despair creates will grow in strength. At its peak, will it be able to affect a zombie? Second, does she still have other beyonder powers I'm not aware of? There's a high chance that it's the case. I'll first make a list and write down my advantages or things that are on par with the demoness of despair. Let's see if I can get any ideas. I can disguise myself. A marionette using its beyonder powers can be considered at the level of a demigod. Instantaneous swapping is also one. Apart from them, there isn't anything else. Yes, considering demoness of despair's current state, I seem to have something that I'm better at than her. She's in a half-crazed state. Her reason comes and goes at random, and she does extreme things. She's easily led around by her instincts. Although she's still good at incitement and allurement, that's an innate quality for catching prey. As for me, I'm in a normal state, and I haven't had any problems with my rationality yet. I'm still able to think and analyze. Don't tell me I need to come out on top using my wit? An idea came to Klein as he gradually formulated a new train of thought and plans. Why must I fight demoness of despair Panatia to the death at this moment? She definitely yearns to escape this foggy town. Deep down in her heart, this will be something that beats her instinctive need to eat. Furthermore, she's still full at the moment. I can try to cooperate with her. She can provide that obsidian rock, and I'll draw the special and secret symbol, putting together the conditions for opening the door. Besides, I'm not too sure about Zeradal. Who knows what schemes he might be up to. He might be secretly plotting something. By pulling a demoness of despair into this, it can effectively make the situation chaotic and restrain him in some way. Cooperation is a diplomatic choice, not a militaristic choice. The effects of an intact stand-in at the demigod level will definitely be better than directly engaging in battle. This is equivalent to me obtaining benefits from both sides. Klein rapidly made a decision. As he pondered on the details of him negotiating to cooperate, he patiently waited for the crimson moon to return behind the fog. After a while, the crimson moonlight that seeped through the dark-colored curtains dimmed. Klein immediately made his marionette pass through the wall and leave where he was hiding. Then, Senor walked onto the streets with the appearance of Gehrman Sparrow, walking straight towards the pitch-black cathedral. In about 10 seconds, Klein discovered that Senor was being affected by an ailment. To the dead, this was completely ineffective, but Klein could foresee that, with the passage of time, the ailment would worsen and turn stranger. It might even affect one's nerves and spirituality. This would make the zombie's actions turn stiff. In the end, even its knees would be unable to bend, making movement only being possible by hopping. Thankfully, I didn't choose to use the plan of letting my marionette control the spirit body threads. Klein immediately made Senor say out loud, "I was inside the cathedral for a while, and I'm not dead. I found a way to escape from this place." After saying that, Gehrman Sparrow sniffed as though his resistance to the ailment had weakened due to the declining state of his body. And at this moment, the white-robed Panatia suddenly appeared at the door of the cathedral. Her hair had been tied up once again, looking neat and tidy. Her slightly crazy-looking but beautiful eyes looked at Gehrman Sparrow as she took out a strangely profound obsidian rock. The contours of the obsidian rock was identical to the inset on the wall behind the cathedral statue. You need it? Panatia asked calmly. Klein discovered that the demoness of despair had dispelled her plague and ailment as he hurriedly made Senor nod. Yes. As long as you place it in the correct location in the cathedral, and match it with a special symbol, we will be able to open a door that allows us to escape. I know that the cathedral's interior is very dangerous to you, but this is mainly a result of spirit-body threads. And as a marionettist, I can control spirit-body threads to prevent you from suffering the fate of being hung up. Panatia fell silent for a few seconds as she curled her lips. With a bright smile, she returned with a question, then, I'll become your marionette? Or you can stop helping me at the critical moment, making me turn into a loitering figure under the moon? Klein was long prepared. He immediately made his marionette reply earnestly, what should I do to make you feel at ease? Panatia didn't immediately reply. After some careful thought, she said, give me your hair and flesh. Curses that demonesses are good at? Using Senor's hair and flesh to curse Gehrman Sparrow? Count me as the loser if that works. As Klein felt grounded, he made the marionette appear in a difficult position. Then wouldn't you be able to kill me at any moment? Panatia replied with a smile, you can hand me the hair and flesh only when entering the cathedral. When inside, if there are any signs of me cursing you, you can give up controlling my spirit-body threads. It will be the same the other way round too. If anything abnormal happens to me, I'll immediately curse you. Once the door is opened, I'll leave first. And at the same time, I'll return the flesh and hair to you. Gehrman Sparrow hesitated for a long time as he discussed the details with the demoness of despair. Finally, he nodded and said, all right, let's do it. Just as Panatia wanted to say something, her eyes suddenly narrowed as she slowly said, for some reason, I'm still a little worried. Chapter 841, Keeping Each Other in Check. What terrifying intuition. Despite not realizing that the Gehrman Sparrow in front of you is a double, you still feel that something is amiss. Hidden in a faraway building, Klein inwardly drew a gasp. His mind raced as he quickly came up with a corresponding strategy. He controlled Senor and made the marionette reply in a deep voice, I'm also a little worried. After opening the door, if you leave first, you can ambush me from the outside once I'm out. You don't even need to ambush me. You can just wait outside. I believe that I should be the first to leave. And before that, you need to return to me my flesh and hair. When the time comes, you can be closer to the door. This way, you will have enough time to pass through the door before your spirit-body threads drift to the top of the cathedral. Panatia listened in silence and returned with a question, then how do I prevent you from destroying the door after you leave? This is also a problem for me, the marionette answered without giving any signs of weakness. When I obtain that special symbol, I'll show it to you. That way, even if I close the door, you will still be able to open it again. Panatia closed her mouth as though she was thinking through the details, but she appeared somewhat irascible and could hardly compose herself. It was as though her inclination for insanity had filled her mind. After about 10 seconds, she said again, I think a pure curse might not be able to harm you. Seers do not lack the means to avoid harm, just like the paper figurine substitutes you used before. She really isn't leaving behind any loopholes. Thankfully, the person in front of you is a fake from top to bottom. As Klein lampooned, he made Senor take out one paper figurine after another. Then, he burned them all in front of the demoness of despair. I can't be sure that you haven't hidden one, Panatia said in suspicion, still somewhat neurotic. Gehrman Sparrow twitched the corners of his mouth in a deadpan manner and said, you can try divination. Aren't witches good at that? Panatia smiled impatiently and said, the spirit world cannot be communicated with in here, and my spirituality. She didn't finish her sentence as the look in her eyes turned somewhat dangerous. Klein knew what the demoness of despair was getting at. Her spirituality had been corrupted due to half a year of eating. It was somewhat chaotic and crazy, making it give unreliable answers, especially against a beyonder that was best at divination. The two reached a stalemate, momentarily unable to resolve the problem of trusting one another. At this moment, on the roof to the left, a hoarse and muffled voice sounded. "I can be your witness." Gairman Sparrow and Panatia turned their heads at the same time and looked over. Mr. A's figure grew out from the shadows as he wore a blood-red hooded robe. "How will you bear witness?" Klein made Seigneur ask. Mr. A pulled down his hood and said with a deep chuckle, "I'll use flesh and blood magic to drill into your body and control your condition. Once you stop controlling the spirit-body threads, or if you try to use paper figurine substitutes, I'll immediately give a warning or attempt to stop you. Once that door you speak of opens, I'll leave your body and pass through the door before my spirit-body threads are affected." "Do you think Gairman Sparrow is an idiot?" Klein made his marionette curl his lips. "Based on what I know, rose bishops can hide in the bodies of others, but the host will immediately die once they leave. No, using that method is to evade investigations, therefore, there's a need to fuse with the host's flesh and blood. But there's no need to do so in this situation. I'll silently wait inside your stomach," Mr. A explained in detail. "No, it's not my stomach. It's Seigneur's stomach." Klein made Gairman Sparrow take out a gold coin and pretend to attempt a divination. This crazy adventurer muttered under his breath as the gold coin in between his fingers was flipped. With a ping, the gold coin flew into the air and landed in his palm. Gairman Sparrow carefully glanced at it. "From the looks of it, you aren't lying. However, you will have to leave my body before I show the special symbol to Lady Despair." If this wasn't done, Gairman Sparrow might end up being murdered by their collusion. After all, if Panatia obtained the door-opening symbol while wielding the obsidian rock, given enough time, she didn't need to worry about any anomalies with her spirit-body threads. Then, she wouldn't need help from Gairman Sparrow at all. Mr. A's existence was only to prevent the use of paper figurine substitutes. However, Gairman Sparrow didn't need to be too worried if Mr. A came out ahead of time. He wasn't even afraid that Panatia would lose decorum after knowing the door-opening symbol, because if that happened, he could rely on paper figurine substitutes to avoid certain death. On the other hand, Panatia wouldn't carry out a pursuit in the cathedral. This was because she would end up being hung up with the passage of time, hence, she needed to seize the opportunity to escape immediately. Besides, there was no way to take the obsidian rock. Gairman Sparrow would then have no chance of any subsequent escape attempts. Although the details of this plan were still flawed, it fully considered the situation of all three parties. Panatia raised her hand and grabbed at the hair that was sliding down her sideburns when she suddenly asked, "If I were to escape first, aren't you afraid that I'll ambush you?" This was also a problem that Gairman Sparrow was previously worried about. Klein immediately made his marionette curl his lips and say, "I'm afraid. But I still have other means of escape. I'll take the risk." Panatia took 2 steps in an irritated manner before finally saying, "We shall do it as agreed then." After making up her mind, her smile became extremely relaxed. "You really are a special man, a man that made me see hope. After we leave, I don't mind letting you experience what extreme pleasure is if you aren't afraid." Gairman Sparrow shifted his gaze away with great effort before looking at Mr. A. "I have no more questions." With the sound of howling wind, Mr. A flew down and landed not far from Gairman Sparrow. His figure, along with his clothes, rapidly melted away, turning into a sticky glob of flesh and blood. Right on the heels of that, the flesh and blood piled onto one another and kept compressing into a tiny stream that had the thickness of an arm. Then, it flowed towards Gairman Sparrow. Far away in a building, Klein felt somewhat disgusted as he retched. Then, he made Gairman Sparrow open his mouth. The flesh and blood stream climbed up the marionette's body and drilled into its mouth. The slightly warm but slippery feeling passed through the gullet and entered the stomach. It's heavy. However, Mr. A's flesh and blood is helping to hold up the stomach, preventing it from sagging too much. Klein inspected the marionette and made him look up at the shrouded crimson moon and say to Panatia, "Let's begin." "All right." Panatia, who could hardly withstand her urges, impatiently walked towards the cathedral's entrance. Klein made Gehrman Sparrow follow by her side and first plucked off his hair before making 2 meat tendrils grow out from his arm before ripping it out. It made blood gush out. If someone very familiar with me were here, they would definitely notice a problem because I can't deal harm to my own body so decisively. Perhaps in the eyes of others, the crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow, can probably do such a deed easily. As Klein noticed a problem and gained experience from his conclusion, he made the marionette pass through the ajar main door of the ancient cathedral. He then handed the hair and flesh to Panatia. Panatia slowed down her pace as she took out an ugly, palm-sized puppet and wiped the flesh over it and tied the hair around its thin neck. She held the cursed puppet in one hand and finally stepped through the cathedral's door. Klein immediately got Gehrman Sparrow to control their spirit-body threads. As for Mr. A, as he had overlapped with the marionette, it wasn't too much of a hassle. Even I can do it. With the powers showcased by Zeradol, he totally has the capability to help Beyonders that are not from the seer pathway to resolve the loss of control over spirit-body threads in the cathedral. This way, as long as he wants the Demoness of Despair to enter, he could have opened the door a long time ago. Why didn't he do it? He is unable to communicate with others beyond the cathedral. That's why seer pathway Beyonders who aren't marionettists or higher can't walk to him. Klein used his marionette senses to analyze the situation remotely. And inside the cathedral, the corpses remained dangling in midair. Their heads were bowed and their eyes were rolled back. From time to time, they would sway with the wind, producing the ravings, hornasis. Phlegria, when Panatia saw this scene, her body instantly stiffened, but she quickly composed herself. Together with Gehrman Sparrow, they walked under the gazes of the hanged. Before long, they saw the pitch-black altar and the statue of the ancient god's descendant. Zeradol remained sitting diagonally behind the statue, wearing a hood and sporting a white beard. When Gehrman Sparrow and Panatia approached, he slowly lifted his head and chuckled. Very good. Beyonders from the seer pathway need to know how to use their brain and not always think of fighting. He seemed to have foreseen that all of the paper figurines of Gehrman Sparrow would be destroyed. He directly reached out his wrinkled palm and grasped at something. His grab pulled out a yellowish-brown goatskin and a quill filled with ink and a bottle of ink. This made Panatia involuntarily twitch her brows. Zeradol picked up the quill and scribbled words and symbols before rolling it up and handing it to Gehrman Sparrow. That's the door-opening symbol, as well as the Bizarro Sorcerer Potion formula you want. They can only last for 45 minutes and cannot be taken out. Klein avoided the Demoness of Despair and unfolded the goatskin, allowing the potion formula and the door-opening symbol to appear before his eyes. Suddenly, his pupils constricted and nearly froze. The door-opening symbol and the symbol provided by the Antigonus family's notebook via the misfortune cloth puppet were mostly the same. It was a vertical eye made up of many mysterious labels. However, there were tiny differences in the details. A crescent pattern had switched spots with a dotted line label. Chapter 842. Behind the door. At that instant, the first thought that surfaced in Klein's mind was, as expected, Zeradol has a ploy. Right on the heels of that, he was thankful that he had obtained the correct door-opening symbol from the Antigonus family's notebook ahead of time. With this newfound confidence, he didn't panic and become at a loss. Zeradol returned the quill and ink bottle to the past, and he lifted his head. Scanning Gehrman Sparrow and Panatia, he said with a sigh, all the conditions are in place. You can now open the door. Upon saying that, he fixed his gaze on Gehrman Sparrow and chuckled. Don't forget to take my urn with you. Just as he said that, his entire body suddenly crumbled into countless points of light and scattered into the surroundings, fusing into the void. It was as though he had long rotted and turned to dust. Left in the spot where he was sitting, there was a tin urn. Its surface had ancient patterns that didn't look anything special. Klein made Gehrman Sparrow take 2 steps forward, bend down, and pick up the tin urn. He found it heavy, nothing like something that was fake. He used the hand holding the goatskin to open the lid and saw that it was filled with grayish-white powder and particles. It didn't have a lustrous glow. It really is just ordinary ashes? Then who helped cremate Zeradol? He cremated himself? After Gehrman Sparrow closed the lid, he casually used this goatskin-wielding hand to take out a piece of flesh from a pocket and swallowed it. Panatia noticed this action as she squinted her eyes at him as though she was asking what he was doing. Klein stuffed the fish into the marionette's mouth as he deliberately adjusted his breathing and said, "I'm a little nervous. I'm not sure if this door-opening symbol works." Panatia had already confirmed that he was eating ordinary fish meat. Although it looked somewhat disgusting, the half-crazy her had lacked the patience to make a further distinction. She moved her gaze away and looked at the urn and smiled. "If it's useless, we can share it. I'll have 1 scoop a day, and it will last a very long time." This demoness mental state is really abnormal. Klein silently sighed. Passing by the eraser angel statue suspected to be the mother of the sky, Gehrman Sparrow came in front of the wall. Then, he turned his body to the side and pointed to the inset and said to Panatia, "Place that obsidian rock inside." Panatia smiled gorgeously as she said with dull eyes, "Let me see the door-opening symbol first. There's no need to be so wary of me. If I really wanted to harm you, I can immediately give up my marionette, and you wouldn't have the time to escape this cathedral. You'll definitely be hung up. When the time comes, I'll saunter in, pick up the obsidian rock and open the door to leave." However, the symbol given by Zeradol is really problematic. It's best I find a person to bear the brunt of it. Klein's mind whirred as he made Gehrman Sparrow lift his palm and pat his abdomen while opening his mouth. A blob of indistinct flesh and blood surged out, piling up ahead and turning into the beautiful feminine Mr. A. Upon seeing this scene, Gehrman Sparrow flicked the goatskin and unrolled it. The special symbol was with the Bizarro Sorcerer potion formula as they were reflected in the eyes of Panatia and Mr. A. Panatia's eyes darted about before she smiled coquettishly and said, "Open the door. You leave first." She had confirmed that Gehrman Sparrow was still helping her control her spirit-body threads, so there was plenty of time for her to wait. As she spoke, she threw the ugly puppet stained with blood and tied-up hair at him. "She's also afraid of an accident." As Klein got Gehrman Sparrow to catch the puppet, he watched the demoness of despair take a few steps forward and insert the obsidian rock into the recess. The two fused together perfectly, not leaving any protrusions. The wall rapidly emitted light and gradually turned transparent. It could be seen that the outside was paved in stone slabs. There were walls with holes and clouds floating in midair. As Panatia took a step to the side, Gehrman Sparrow held the puppet, goatskin, and urn in his left hand and reached out his right palm. He then used his finger as a pen and drew the vertical line made up of several secret symbols on the transparent wall. During this process, Klein was in a dilemma. He wasn't sure if he should draw Zeradol's symbol or the Antigonus family's one. Although he believed that Zeradol was problematic and had a scheme, he felt that he had belittled this powerful figure after calming down. If Zeradol's sole purpose was to harm him and everyone else with him, there was no need for him to mention the opening of the door. All he needed to do was wait patiently to achieve his goals. Furthermore, with the gray fog's aura completely severed and screened from Klein by the foggy town, he couldn't figure out why Zeradol would target him. Therefore, his final judgment was that Zeradol's goal was to coax someone into opening the door to allow him to obtain something or escape something. As for whether there was danger after the door opening, that wasn't within his considerations. If scattering the ashes was genuine and rather important, it was likely to be relatively safe after heading out. In short, danger was at every turn. That also meant that Zeradol's door-opening symbol was real, and the probability that it didn't carry any danger was 50%. And on the other hand, the Antigonus family's notebook wasn't necessarily kind-hearted. The scene that Klein had seen from the divinations he did above the gray fog, and the information he obtained from Zeradol, and the fact that Zeradol had lost control and gone mad, he could basically determine that the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range's Antigonus family's treasure might very well be an enticing trap. Then, whether there was any latent risks in the complex picture provided by the notebook, that was something that needed consideration. On the one hand it's a tiger, and on the other hand it's a wolf. It's the ultimate choice of the lesser evil. Also, the Antigonus family symbol is for entering the treasure trove. It doesn't mean that it can be used to leave. As Klein contemplated, he didn't stop drawing while he quickly approached the part which was different. At this moment, he stole a glance at Panatia and discovered that her eyes had a glint in them as she wore a smile. It felt like she had the urge to try. If she's normal, as a senior instigator, she should be able to control her expressions. Besides, she just saw the door-opening symbol as well. Klein's heart stirred as he let the marionette draw the symbol provided by Zeradal. Soon, the complicated vertical eye was drawn. Pure light enveloped the area as they traversed the patterns and finally gathered together. Amidst a spectacular blast of light, an illusory, double door filled with secrecy appeared on the wall. Due to the push from Gehrman Sparrow, it slowly opened. Behind the door was the ancient stone tiles and hole-ridden walls they had previously seen. Everything was very silent and there were zero abnormalities. At this moment, Panatia's figure suddenly shattered, turning into mirror fragments. At the same time, the lady in a pure white robe appeared in front of Gehrman Sparrow and passed through the door. And in her hand, there was an additional ugly puppet stained with blood, its neck coiled with a strand of hair. As for the one in Gehrman Sparrow's hand, it had degenerated into a piece of glass. In terms of magical illusions, a Demoness of Despair was several times superior to Klein. After Panatia passed through the door first, she half turned around and faced Gehrman Sparrow, revealing a crazy and teasing smile. Black flames soared from her palm as she ignited the puppet. At that moment, it was as though she was saying, "Despair. Plunge into the deepest pit of despair just as hope arrives." Only then did Klein realize that the curse couldn't be diverted or weathered by paper figurine substitutes. Panatia immediately turned around, preparing to depart from the foggy town and the ancient cathedral, afraid that an accident would happen. At that moment, her eyes suddenly froze. Her body crumbled, transforming into one mirror after another. However, she wasn't able to put a distance further than 10 meters between her and the door. In just a second or two, Panatia let out a sharp cry as invisible threads and thick, black hair curled around her, binding her within. Her exterior was covered in black flames as she froze into layers of ice. Suddenly, all of this disintegrated. Demoness of Despair. Panatia's eyes effused clear, deep despair and regret. Her expression rapidly turned stiff as her neck seemed to be held up by an invisible hand. Her entire body rose into the air and hung there, her eyes rolling back bit by bit, but her looks remained immaculate. On the side of the door, Gehrman Sparrow's body had been enveloped in black flames and began melting like wax. As for Mr. A, who had planned on flying through the door, he began retching, vomiting one fresh mushroom after another. His body began to sprout mushrooms as if a drizzle had just passed. Before Gehrman Sparrow lost his vision, the scene behind the door pulled close, presenting an empty foyer. No, it wasn't empty. Hanging in midair were even more corpses. They were of all ages and sexes. Some were dressed exquisitely, others gorgeously, ancient, or casually. These corpses were like the ones hanging in the cathedral. They all floated up as they came and went as though they were acting in a grand musical, accurately reflecting a musical of the daily lives and details a town should have. Klein saw that, behind these hanged corpses, there was a transparent and slimy tentacle. It was covered in complex patterns with secrecy hidden within. It was as though it could drive anyone crazy. Countless tentacles extended deep into the foyer, and there sat an ancient, huge stone chair. Its surface was inlaid with dull gold and gems. This. Klein tensed up as he didn't hesitate to close his eyes and cut his connection with the marionette. In his mind, the scene that he had seen from his previous divination surfaced. Seated on the huge chair were countless translucent maggots that clustered together. They squirmed slowly as they grew freely, extending out nearly invisible tentacles. And the final scene that was embedded in the marionette's vision was at the bottom of the ancient chair. A tarot card sat there silently. Its surface was also that of Roselle. The emperor was wearing a gorgeous head accessory and colorful clothes. It held a stick with luggage hanging from it as though he was on a long trip. He had a visionary look, and beside him was a puppy. At the corner were shiny words, Sequence 0, the Fool. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.